Today, we're going to do a slightly different introduction than we usually do. We're going to focus more on the 20th century and the economy than we have previously. If you want sort of a more long-term understanding of the conflict tracking back over 1,000 years, the previous presentations that are recorded go into that history. So that's always a resource that you can look to. Now, the rules for those of you who are unfamiliar. This is not an academic presentation. As you heard from our introductions, I'm a lawyer by training. Aaron is former military. Greg he has experience of having grown up in Russia, but we are all not experts in this particular field. And we're going to try and give this from a secular, neutral perspective. We may be slightly more pro-Ukrainian in our biases, but we will try as best as we can to look at the situation objectively and from multiple sides. Let's be respectful of the current situation, but that said, we love interactivity, questions, comments, clarifications, concerns. Please put them in the chat. The majority of this presentation's time will be taken up with responding to your questions. So if you have those, please put them in the chat, and I will be emceeing, reviewing those questions for discussion at that point as well. Now, it's going to be a short presentation, then a discussion afterwards, as I said. So the questions that I'll address during the short presentation are those directly related to what we're talking about in the short presentation. If it's a question more about the current situation in general, we'll address that during the discussion. And as I said, like the other episodes, this is a recording, so you can watch it later. And all right. So one of the things that's worth pointing out is that when Russia expanded into Ukraine, there was a huge settlement by Russians into the territory that stretches from the Donbass in the east with that 69 and 75% all the way through towards the Moldova border. And you can see places where Russians form significant populations within Ukraine, matching more or less the areas that came under Russian control in the 18th century. And when Ukraine entered the 20th century, it entered the 20th century as a territory in the Russian Empire. Like many other states, Russia during the 19th century was a strongly expansionist country, conquering areas inhabited inhabited majoritarily by non-Russians. And Ukraine was one of these territories. The similarity, though, between the Ukrainian language and the Russian language led to Ukraine being considered part of Russia's pan-Slavic orientation. That said, after World War I, a lot of the territories that had been part of Russia were lost to them because of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which Russia signed to get out of World War I and gave the Germans control of a significant amount of territory. The direct result of that was that many of the states between Russia and Germany became independent or quasi-independent for a few years. And one such example is the Ukrainian People's Republic, which you can see here, controlling a lot of the territory of modern Ukraine, a little bit further eastward, and having some territories that extend into modern Belarus or modern Poland as well. You can see the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk between the Russians and the Germans. And the symbol of that independent Ukraine is, of course, now recognizable as the symbol of modern Ukraine, modern Ukraine having harkened back to this image. Do any of our panelists want to comment on this sort of development of the first Ukrainian state in modern times? I think that, yeah.
I mean, I do think one thing, and I'm sure Greg can comment on this too, is that there's been this strange fluctuation between whether it's czars, Soviet leaders, or now Russian leaders, where either Ukraine is a place, it's a real place with real people, or it's Russian. And there's been this sort of fluctuation over the last, let's say, 150 years. And I think that's something that isn't really discussed much. It's only viewed in either sort of absolute terms, where either they were all Russian under a czar, They were a state once Khrushchev says they were, or they're not a state anymore because Putin says they are. And I think it's a more complicated dynamic than that. So I don't know if Greg, if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah. Let's say during the Soviet times, even though there was such a like in your internal passport, there was your nationality was stated, and if you are Ukrainian, ethnically Ukrainian, you were stated as Ukrainian. But if you're Russian, stated Russian. If you're Jewish, stated Jewish. But most of the people, at least from my perspective, I lived in Moscow. I didn't see much difference between Ukrainians and Russians. However, I've known some later on. I've known some Ukrainians who actually thought that was not so. From the Ukrainian side, where a lot of Ukrainians felt kind of downgraded and dismissed. But I can only speak about my personal experience. Certainly, since the foundation in 1991 of the Ukrainian Republic, whatever the Ukrainian identity existed prior, it's now being reinforced and really formed to the full extent. That's my understanding, and that's regardless of the language, whether it's Russian. I'm sure the Russian language will diminish in Ukraine from now on. But prior to this, most of the people who died, civilians who died in Ukraine, they're Russian-speaking Ukrainians or even Russians. So that's pretty absurd. That's how I see it.
Yeah, I think a fundamental piece that you sort of alluded to is that ethnicity is not a static component. And people sort of imagine that if you wind the clock back and you walked in these territories, people would say just as emphatically then as they do today, that, I'm Ukrainian or I'm a Russian or I'm a Belarusian or I'm a Moldovan or any of these other ethnicities with the same degree of alacrity that we do. But really, nationalism and ethnic identity is something that in the case of most people is really only a 200-year phenomenon, if that. And in the case of Ukraine, because of its relationship with the Soviet Union and how that changed throughout the 20th century, the definition of Ukrainianness is still very much a controversial subject within Ukraine and a constantly shifting one.
Yeah, and I think one other thing that's important to remember is that this just didn't pop out of left field, right? So you had the Polish-Lithuanian Empire that when it collapsed, and you look at the sort of far western part of Ukraine, that is the old Polish-Lithuania, and that is the Catholic Ukraine, really. And so there is and we don't always talk as much about the religious separation, primarily because I think religion is more of a political device and how it's leveraged, but that there was really a substantial split in Ukraine between Eastern Orthodox and Catholic Europe, and that wasn't for 10 years or 50 years. That was for hundreds of years, really for the better part of almost half a millennia. So I think there's a lot of these almost ethno-religious geographic boundaries that are, I'm going to say, are still there, but they're not there, right? They still exist, and they exist in people's consciousness at various stages.
Right. No, I actually have a question in the comments. Other than who has the rightful claim to the geography issue, could one compare the distinguishing of nationalities between Ukrainian and Russian similar to the distinguishing of nationalities between US Americans and Canadian Americans?
Yeah,
No.
I would take this more along the, I know you've done a great series on this, Richard, more on the sort of Bulgarian, Balkan sort of, splits that you have around ethno-national religious boundaries, even though that's more compressed there. this is a lot more. I think this is a much more realistic parallel, or it's almost a direct parallel, I think.
Yeah,
I don't
no,
know. What do you
I think
think?
the fundamental distinction between US Americans and Canadian Americans is simply the relationship with the British in 1775. I don't really see any fundamental worldview distinctions between
Yep,
Canadians and US Americans. You can say that perhaps Canadians might be slightly more left of center in terms of politics, but then that's because you're looking at Toronto and Montreal and you're not looking at Saskatchewan,
that's right.
which would bleed right into Middle America. So
Exactly.
I think that the distinctions in Ukraine and Russia are much more fundamental and reach to the sort of creation of Russia, which was as an imperial expansionist project, and not necessarily everybody who was part of that project was enamored with being part of that project. And at different points, especially we're going to see during the 20th century, Ukrainians felt like the Russian dominated aspect of the Russian imperial project, as manifest in the Soviet Union and in the previous Russian empires, didn't really see Ukraine as a priority and didn't really see Ukrainians as a people worth supporting.
Yeah, and I wanted to add that there is a question of ethnicity in Ukraine and Russia the situation, which doesn't exist in the United States at this point. There is no such ethnicity as United States or Canadian. It's so mixed of the. So here it's definitely exists, and also there is a difference prior to the World War II. Part of the Ukraine was not part of the Soviet Union. So in that western part, the Ukrainian identity already is much stronger than at the area that belonged to, like Eastern Ukraine, that belonged to the Soviet Union, even right after the World War I or Civil War. And that's why even right now, the Ukrainian identity is much more defined in the West and in the East, but that's changing now. I think now the whole country really kind of realized and feel their identity much stronger.
Yeah, I mean, you could make an argument that this is the beginning, what we're in right now, of the modern national. Like the nationalist, not ethno-nationalist, but nationalist project. Because when you have, especially if this evolves into a frozen or a long war, you will have so many large-scale population movements from all kinds of regions, right? People coming in and out. So there'll be such a, blending of people over years that I think the legacy sort of ethno lines will become very muddled, and then sort of the Ukrainian national identity will form. That's, I think, a more universalist identity. Not immediately, but I think that would happen over 5, 10, 15 years, especially as it oriented more towards Europe, and became, whatever, an EU light member or EU member or whatever other version it'll evolve into.
Yeah, so I wanted to advance to the next map because this really shows sort of the competing territorial interest, right? Aaron referred to the historic Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and there was an attempt, in a certain sense, by Josip Piłsudski, who you can see on the right-hand side. He was a Polish general, quote, president, end quote, of the Republic of Poland. And his view was of a Polish imperial project similar to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that was expansionist and incorporated numerous non-Polish ethnicities to create an effective buffer between the German and Russian empires, right? And so you can see in this map here, all those territories all those territories east of the area where Polish people are dominant. That's sort of mid red area around Warsaw, and you can see that really dark burgundy area closer to the southeast, which is almost all ethnically Ukrainian. And so there has been this push and shove that Ukrainians have felt between being next to a powerful Poland in this case and a powerful Russia in the other case.
Yeah, and so this is a great point and something extremely understudied for all kinds of political reasons and sort of, let's call it dark history reasons, is that in essence, Poland and Ukraine as a subset of Poland have always been these buffer regions between the Russians or the Eastern Orthodox, super, Greater Russia, or the Prussians, and then eventually the Germans as they became a state. And arguably, the Poles were always attempting to use the Ukrainians. I don't mean to make it that simplistic, but kind of as their buffer. And so there's always been these buffered peoples projects, and at the same time, obviously, construct a sort of regenerative Polish, Lithuanian, Ukrainian empire or micro empire, which of course the Russians and the Germans or Prussians prior to that, never wanted and dealt with it by breaking up Poland half a dozen times over the last 400 years. So, that's, I think that background is consistently missed. I mean, I in the last 3 months, I literally, except for our discussion, haven't heard anyone talk about Polish partitions, in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries and or through the 20th centuries. It's just not something people bring up. And it obviously informs being Polish, especially today, in that is your existential project. You will fight to the last Pole to never let that happen ever again in 1,000 years. And that's something.
Could,
go ahead,
could
please.
I add a little bit to this period? Because specifically in that period, when under Piłsudski, Poland pursued the policy of erasing Ukrainian identity. The part of Volyn and Galicia, there was a forced, and there were a lot of people died as a result of it, and it created a resistance. And usually it's a resistance to the outside enemy that really forms the national identity. That's why this Galicia and Volyn specifically is the nucleus of Ukrainian identity nowadays, because they had started to form very strongly around this area that is being prosecuted by Poland. And now, there is a resistance to Russia on a much bigger scale and bigger territory, and that's definitely contributes tremendously to the formation of the Ukrainian identity, solidification, I would say. Yeah.
Absolutely. 2 additional points before we move on from here. One of the points that we should make very clear is that while these maps show generally where there were large Polish communities, Ukrainian communities, Belarusian communities, and the rest of it, these areas are and were until midway through the 20th century very strongly integrated with numerous minority groups. So just because it was a majority Ukrainian area in the southeast doesn't mean that there weren't a lot of Poles and Jews, for example, in those areas, and vice versa, that there were Ukrainians, Belarusians, and others in majority Polish areas. And the other comment I wanted to make was related to what Aaron said, where you have these buffer states. One of the fundamental changes that we're seeing in large international relations and politics is that we're moving from the unipolar system where the United States was able to effectively be the peace master and policeman, right, for the entire world. Where we're very familiar with this thing of America's not the world's policeman, but effectively it was. It would arbitrate disputes between numerous different parties, and we see a relaxing of that. America's power is lessening in the world, and other countries are beginning to create spheres of influence similar to the Great Powers period before. And
I mean, that's a fantastic point. I mean, I would argue we are in sort of the Council of Europe 2.0, but not Europe. It's worldwide. And a lot of it has to do with as these regional large states become rich or richer at a substantial level, order of magnitude to what they were, they have an enormous ability to project power, economic security, regional institutions, everything. And whether it's Nigeria, whether it's Turkey, whether it's Iran, whether, and I argue there's a couple dozen of these states around the world that have regional or are forming their own regional power spheres. And as they all become, eventually maybe $1 trillion GDP states, they can just sustain that. And I think that's a dynamic. And I would argue Poland is one of those actually, or it's becoming one of those. It's figuring out how to become one of those.
Yeah, exactly, especially as the border moves further east. Now, one of the things that we sort of have to address is that as Poland was expanding into the westernmost parts of Ukraine, the Soviet Union in 1920 was able to take over the rest of Ukraine because, as we mentioned, Ukraine became Ukraine became independent from 1918 to 1920, but in 1920, the invasion from the Soviet Union was able to take over that territory. And throughout the 1930s, we begin to have what is called the Holodomor, or the Great Famine. And it's important to point out that Ukraine has historically been a breadbasket for either the Russian Empire or for other states. And the fact that Ukraine went hungry has very little to do with actual agricultural productivity within Ukraine. It has to do with an explicit policy from the Soviet leadership to remove grain that was grown in Poland and redistribute it from Moscow, meaning that Ukrainians were starving despite being at the forefront of grain production in Russia. And you can see the number of daily direct deaths in the various months in the year 1933. On the lower right-hand side, we're talking about tens of thousands of people dying every day. And you can see the map, the picture on the upper right-hand side of two people that look like they're passed out on the sidewalk there. Those are two people literally dying of hunger in the streets of Kharkiv, which is the city, of course, that's being shelled in the east of Ukraine, at least heavily in the earlier part of April.
And a quick point here, you could make an argument this was the Great Leap Forward 1.0. Phase, and to put the sort of daily deaths in context, because we've all, living through, surviving, hopefully through COVID, is that, Ukraine was 10 times smaller of the population of what the US is now. And these deaths are, if you could put them on that scale, you could recognize what the scale of this would be. This would be civilizational, which I argue it was. And I think, and I know Richard will go more into this, this wasn't the only bad thing that happened in Ukraine. This was just one of the larger bad things. And so you had a half a century of depopulation almost. It was almost half a century of Ukraine, and which of course is very fundamental to their identity for obvious reasons.
Absolutely. In addition, and I just wanted to sort of explain the map on the left-hand side for those who can't read Ukrainian. The map on the left-hand side shows the amount of deaths that occurred in any particular province. The darker the color is, right? For example, you have those three black provinces. They lost the largest numbers of people, between 192.3 million and 192.3 thousand. Yeah. 192.3 thousand and 232.5 thousand. And so you can see Kiev, for example, is right there in the upper left, one of the black ones. And you can see a number of the other provinces. Even Donetsk, which lost the lowest amount, lost 31,000 people, 31,900 people.
To 71,000 in that range. So let's say split it. Let's say it's 50,000.
Yeah.
And then the other thing to recognize is obviously human beings, when these things are happening, are trying not to just stay where it's happening. So you have just incredible displacement internally and externally, right? So, really the whole, you arguably have state collapse is basically what you have. It becomes a failed state in so much as either the Poles or the Russians block populations from moving around, which of course happened.
And to add insult to that injury, right, as you're having that kind of crisis of leadership and population, the Russian authorities were actively removing the leaders of the Ukrainian population. This was called, these individuals called kulaks were either low-level bourgeoisie or large-scale landowners, people in that sort of vein. And these people were rounded up and killed so their lands could be redistributed and then put under this system of grain expropriation. So while Stalin was coordinating all of this, right? So he's created this situation in Ukraine where they effectively are dying and are losing people and are leaderless because their leaders have effectively been removed. It further weakens the area and further engenders large-scale conflict without leaders to galvanize the people in any way that could form an effective resistance. As a result of this, we have some Ukrainian support for the Nazis when they invade in 1941. Now, we're going to discuss as well the Ukrainian support of the Allies in the end and throughout World War I. But I first wanted to focus on the Nazi collaboration because that's part of Putin's argument that he's trying to denazify Ukraine. Aaron, what do you want to add?
No, World War II. I was going to point out. World War II. You said World War I. Yeah.
This is World War II. And so probably the most important individual in terms of taking what's seen as a pro-Nazi position was Stepan Bandera. And Stepan was one of the few Ukrainian leaders trying to push for an independent Ukraine, and he saw the Nazis as possible allies in achieving that goal. Greg, would you like to sort of inform a little bit about this period?
Yeah, well, the most important thing, well, he was later prosecuted by Germans, by Nazis, because they didn't want the creation of independent state that went against and he was arrested and spent some time in jail, and because of supposedly he participated into the pogroms and prosecution of Jews. He later on, after the war, he was assassinated by a Jewish nationalist. But the main thing is that the name of Bandera, this has became identification of Nazism in Russian mentality that is widely used right now. There is a word, Banderovцы, which would means that the followers of this movement. It's questionable how Nazi was Stepan Bandera personally. I think he was, but some people question that. But you know, it's identification with this name, and that's what the word denazification that is used by Russian government right now is. They're basically saying that the followers of Bandera are Nazis, and they control the country, they control the government, and even control a Jewish president. He is from their point of view, especially from the latest the comments by the foreign minister Lavrov, he is a collaborator with Nazis, despite that he's Jewish. I mean, that's the idea. That's a very anti-Semitic, point of view, very insulting to Jews.
Well, just to elaborate on that 1 second. So Lavrov did come up, and who is the foreign minister, and said that Hitler himself had a Jewish roots, which was extremely offensive to Jews, and he also had said the anti-Semitism took its roots in the Jewish culture itself. So the Jews themselves are anti-Semitic, which is extremely, again, offensive, and therefore it seems to be like Russia just wants to point out that even though they do have a Jewish president, Nazifying the nation, so to speak, does not get prevented, and therefore they're trying to rewrite the history and saying that Nazis themselves were Jewish. Like, this doesn't make any sense.
I mean, I think this is all part of where we brought up earlier, the sort of delegitimization of Ukraine, or Ukraine having even state actors. So it's attempting to basically delegitimize the fact that there could be state actors that define and represent Ukraine. One other point here around this is that even though this was a much larger scale than what happened in Finland, a very similar version of this process of German collaboration happened in Finland, and the Germans were, let's say, semi-effective, at least in the beginning, of leveraging actors in both Ukraine and in Finland against Soviet and Soviet onslaught, and they could obviously play to their state nationalist roots and say that we'll support you, whatever. To me, the big difference is that the construction of SS divisions in Ukraine, I mean, that's not something you do when you don't have deep sort of threshold allies. So at the end of the day, there were enough allies of Nazi Germany that they felt comfortable enough to construct, full-blown functional SS divisions. And to me, that speaks that there was a substantial enough minority that supported them, not just in sort of state survival terms of building a pro-Ukrainian, but actually many of their aims.
And just to add to that, to Aaron's point, so this guy Bandera and Shukhevich created groups called UPA, which is the Ukrainian national group that actually fought both Nazis at the end and Soviets as part of the German, but not to be confused. All they wanted to see is independent Ukraine. They collaborated with Nazis. I mean, they might as well could have collaborated if England would have invaded, because it's just Soviets had implemented this a really rigid, Holodomor regime on them, and they also Germans had no intention of creating independent Ukraine. For Slavs, they call them slaves, right? Jews were not allowed to exist, and they were killed in concentration camps. And for Slavs, just like Ukrainians, Russians, they were slaves. In fact, the way they treated Soviet POW, which many of them were Ukrainians as well, leaving them in the open field and not feeding them, and they were dying. I don't even want to offend animals. I mean, it was just horrible. They were cannibalism. It was just unbelievable. Yeah.
And I think one other thing to build on what happened in the 30s, now in the 40s, is the concept of the bloodlands, which I know Greg knows about, because this whole region sort of defined as the bloodlands, where depends on your accounting, but the losses are minimum 7-8 million up to maybe 20 million, so 13-14 million people across the region, and Ukraine had another sizable version of that, 3-4 million, whatever. So you had each decade a loss of literally 10% of the population. And in historical terms, and I don't mean short-term history, I mean millennial history, there's very few places on earth that have sustained multi-decade 10% losses of their population, and then obviously you have displacement, people leaving, right? People coming to anywhere else in the world. I mean, there's a reason there was a huge migration of Ukrainians and Ukrainian Russians to the United States, to Canada, to Western Europe, to pretty much anywhere in the first half of the 20th century. So a place, it's very rare a place can survive losing half of its population in less than half a century. That's go ahead, please.
Yeah, I wanted to say, in fairness to Ukrainians, we're talking about the Ukrainian collaborators with Nazis. They were really a minority. The overwhelming majority of Ukrainians fought against Nazis and participated in guerrilla movements and were in the Soviet army. The overwhelming majority of and they sustained huge losses, and of course there were collaborators from anywhere. There were also Russian collaborators under the Vlasov, so I would just have to see this issue of Stepan Bandera in perspective to everything else.
Absolutely. One final thing I wanted to leave before we move into the pro-Allied side of the Ukrainian world is that as part of the creation of the modern Ukrainian national identity, and we have to be sort of honest about this, part of the creation of the modern Ukrainian national identity is to look through history for heroes who stood up for an independent Ukraine. And Stepan Bandera was one of those heroes, right, who stood up for an independent Ukraine. We also have a number of other individuals like Khmelnytsky, who was also known in Jewish circles for having persecuted many Jews, even though he was one of the first Ukrainians to fight for Ukrainian state against the Polish. And so there becomes this veneration of Ukrainians who have this sort of negative past because they were standing up for something along the lines of an independent Ukraine. And so some of their sins tend to be whitewashed, especially in a more nationalist crowd. To that end, we should sort of mention, right, the modern inculcation of this Nazistic belief in a small degree, a small number of Ukrainians. That's the Azov battalion, right? And so you have that sort of ultra-right nationalistic core. They don't make up a significant portion of the Ukrainian military or foreign militias working in Ukraine, but they do exist, and they do bring back some of these ideologies through hero worship of these Nazi leaders.
Yeah. And one other kind of, or two other quick points here is, one is, so there, I think in the modern era, and I think this is something Ukraine will have to, and will confront, is there is this sort of, I call it like the Japan gap, right? Like there's just this gap in history of Japanese people understanding what the Japanese imperial project did in Asia, during, the World War II, or at the beginning of its World War II in the early 30s through to 45. And there's a version of that. It's much smaller, but it's really there. And then the second piece, and this is very real, is that very much like in Italy too. So there's a very strong football culture, soccer, in Ukraine, and just like there is almost anywhere else, you have basically what are called ultras. Think of them as super fans. But let's say in the United States, Canada, you don't have them as much. England, you used to have them, but then it sort of became somewhat illegal. But in Ukraine, it's not, or in most other parts of Europe, it's not. And those groups, which are small, but they act as almost like gangs for that club. Most of them have what you would call somewhere on the order of far right to extreme far right views. And that is a population that will have a sort of, use of symbols, kind of a weird use of symbols, right? Like kind of a grab bag, very much like young people on the internet will just grab 15 different things that are in conflict with each other and construct something else. And so there is this dynamic that is very real. And that does provide this sort of bench of people. And of course, this war, these were a lot of the young men who obviously volunteered or were conscripted into the Ukrainian army. So there is that reality there. And I do think that's something Ukraine has to, truly confront. And I think they will, because it's obviously makes it unsustainable for them to be in Europe and have a significant far right wing army, that has some very strange historical nationalist beliefs.
So, as Greg mentioned, within the Red Army, there were a large number of Ukrainians. It's believed that 4.5 million Ukrainians served in some capacity on the Allied side. For context, fewer than 1 million were on the Stepan Bandera, Yaroslav Selko pro-Nazi or Nazi-aligned side. So it should really give
Axis
you a sense
side, basically.
Yeah, on the Axis side. So that should really give you a sense of where the Ukrainians truly felt at home. Now, within the Soviet military was not segregated on the basis of ethnicity. So it's very rare that we have Ukrainian divisions, for want of a better term. We have 4 Ukrainian fronts. That's the First Ukrainian Front, and the majority of soldiers in the Ukrainian fronts were Ukrainian by an overwhelming margin, but most Ukrainians didn't serve in the Ukrainian fronts. They served in the combined Soviet Soviet military, and so they served in those forms. They also served as partisans, and the distinction between the partisans and the military is that the partisans hid out in the forests and targeted the Nazis through hit and run actions. We also have Ukrainians joining as foreign volunteers in nearly every military that is conceivable. So you can see, for example, this is General Władysław Anders. He is a general in the Polish army, and he had numerous Ukrainians serving under his lead. There were 400 Ukrainians, for example, who were part of, it's either 400 or 4,000, who were part of the American military.
Yeah,
So,
4,000. Yeah. And you also had Hungarian partisans across the Balkans. I mean, so there were Ukrainians fighting, partisan war pretty much everywhere, but probably even in North Africa through the U.S. Army, basically. So, I mean, it was pretty much everywhere in Europe that you could fight as a partisan. There were Ukrainians.
Absolutely. And you can also see that in modern Ukraine today, it's not just Zelensky, but in modern Ukraine today, there has been an increasing respect for the Jewish heritage in Ukraine, which is also a direct refutation of Nazism and the more nationalist aligned perspective that Ukraine is defined by the people who stood up against the Soviet Union, and therefore is sort of in opposition to that sort of Nazi alliance through this. One of the particularly interesting things, right, is that many of the Holocaust memorials in Ukraine, when Ukraine became independent, began to contextualize the fact that it was a Jewish genocide that took place there. During the Soviet period, there was a lot of emphasis on the fact that Soviets died there, but not the contextualization of why those Soviets died there, right? Because it wasn't just a random assortment of Soviets. It was Jews who were specifically targeted and brought to places like Babyn Yar, where over 33,000 Jews were killed in a single day. Does anybody else want to comment on Ukrainians in the Red Army, Ukrainians on the Allied side before we move on?
I mean, I think only one other thing that's important, it's this sort of history and politics of memory, is that because you had such a complex conflict environment in the Ukraine in World War II, you have a big loss of all the other losses of Ukraine, and so there's almost a competition for loss, because is it the 30s starvation? Is it the Jews of the Holocaust in Ukraine? Is it the Soviet and German hard labor? Basically another form of non-Jewish death camps. I mean, is it so there's this like I said, it's we're talking from the 20s through, from basically 1918 to 1945, you had 25% of the population at least that were killed, and if not more like 50% that were displaced and left. And so, there's this this almost regional periodic Holocaust that isn't unique to one group, but happened to the people that happen to live in that region. And I think that informs an enormous amount of the drivers for existential survival, obviously, because nobody ever wants to repeat that.
Absolutely. No, I have a comment pointing out that anti-Semitic surveys tend to show Ukraine being among the least anti-Semitic countries in Europe, with Dnipro having one of the largest Jewish community centers on the European continent. All right. So once World War II is over, Ukraine is brought back into the Soviet sphere, and the Polish parts of Ukraine that Piłsudski had added to his empire became part of Soviet Ukraine. And as far as I'm aware, and perhaps our panelists can elucidate this further, there wasn't anything specifically repressive about the Soviet system in Ukraine or against Ukrainians, but the Soviet system was overall a repressive system. And so you have situations like large-scale Gulag deportations, heavy industrialization leading to an increased difficulty of Ukrainians finding a place. And of course, there's an incredible surveillance state that's based out of Moscow, under which all Soviets sat. And so it was a very difficult period for Ukrainians, just as part of the Soviet system.
Yeah.
As opposed
I
to
mean, the one thing I would say is from a Soviet system standpoint, the misfortune that they were a breadbasket, because then that, I think, prioritized them as a target. And, whereas if they had less valuable resources, they would have just been a normal target of Soviet repression. So they became sort of a super target, is, I think, the only thing that it would be different. And given the region they were in as a buffer, that also meant that they were prioritized from a Soviet defensive perspective. And so I think, and then I would also maybe separate the degrees of repression. So the 1920, basically the Stalin era, or the Civil War to the end of Stalin's life era of repression, and then the post-Stalin, which was a change from just a repression. I mean, I think the repression basically stopped under Khrushchev. I'm not saying it was a good time, but it wasn't Stalin-like repression.
Yeah, if I may add, my perception that, Stalin was repression towards everyone, but I don't have a perception that during the Soviet times after the World War II, the Ukrainians were specifically targeted at all.
Yeah,
I mean, their culture were kind of neglected. Russians generally dismissed Ukrainian culture, literature, and the language. The official, even though people in Ukraine studied both Russian and Ukrainian, but the administrative language was Russian, and there was no point learning Ukrainian for any practical reason. But people did, and a lot of people who lived in the eastern Ukraine, they didn't really. They went to classes, but they couldn't speak Ukrainian. Many of them in the eastern Ukraine, but in the western, as I said before, there was more identification, and there were people who were very fluent.
Now, out of curiosity, maybe you know this, maybe you don't. Why is there such an influence, such a pressure in Belarus to avoid using the Belarusian language? Did that also come from Soviet times?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's the same thing, but in Belarusia, there was no Western region that was a kind of like a nucleus of the identity. There was no such thing. They're much more Russified. So yeah, it's very few people really speak. Even now, there is no such pronounced kind of movement towards the Belarusian language, because they're heavily dependent on Russia. They're at least their leadership, and so it's still mostly Russian.
Yeah, and I would say the piece about Belarus is that this whole, and I'm sure Greg can go into this too, this whole concept of sort of, Greater Russia, Little Russia, white bread, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of we'll call it hierarchy schemes for the last few hundred years that have referred to, really Belarusian people, basically. And obviously what you would now call Northern Ukrainian people too. But that's something that has been very permanent in Russian identity pre-Soviet. I mean, that's something that goes back hundreds of years. I mean, it really goes back to those conflict boundaries between the Polish, Lithuanian, and the Eastern Orthodox, Greater Russia sphere of influence, and the Polish, Lithuanian, more, let's say, Western orientation. And one of the sad dimensions of this is that arguably the Polish-Lithuanian Empire and Commonwealth was one of the most ecumenically diverse, really, in all of history, until probably the United States. So you had people from literally every diverse background religiously across all the faiths, basically. So you had this very strange hardening that happened because of that conflict between the Russians, or the Greater Russia, even Tsarist Russia and all the way through Soviet, basically.
Mhm. One thing that's worth pointing out, and it's sort of pivotal to Russia's claim over Crimea, is that the territory of Ukraine changed over the 20th century. Now, if we look at that sort of pink dash line in the western part, those are the territories that were claimed by the independent Ukrainian People's Republic. The areas in the east were ones that they claimed, but they couldn't really exercise control over those areas. But Crimea had been under Russian control pretty much nonstop until 1954, when Khrushchev transferred it to Ukrainian control. And so the Russians make the argument that it was a historically Russian territory with a large Russian population, so it should be repatriated to Russia. At least that was the argument that they made in 2014 when they took it from the Ukrainians through military force. And we can also see in the West, that sort of Polish area that Greg was talking about, that area where people continued to speak Ukrainian as a dominant language because it had existed outside of the Russian sphere of influence for quite a while, and therefore retained that nucleus of Ukrainianness.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that the way Khrushchev brought Crimea under the Ukrainian Socialist Republic in 1954 was mostly done for the logistical reasons, because as you could see, all of the connections with the water supply and all kinds of goes through this very small isthmus towards Ukraine. And of course, he also put it at the anniversary of 300 years of unification of Ukraine and Russia that happened during the time of Tsar Alexius.
All right, so as we move out of the Soviet period and we move into the 1990s, we then have this big question that a lot of Russian nuclear weapons were positioned in the territory of a now independent state of Ukraine, the Republic of Ukraine. And there were massive numbers of missile batteries in the 5 cities shown on the map on the lower left-hand side. And so there was a discussion throughout the early 90s, culminating in 1994 with an article with agreements between President Clinton, President Yeltsin of Russia, and President Kravchuk of Ukraine that would lead to the sending of those missiles back to Russian territory. And at the same time, the signing of the Budapest Memorandum, which would guarantee Ukrainian safety between Russia and the Western powers.
Yeah, and I think this is such a critical period to understand Ukraine's transition into an independent state, and as part of it, the transition of nuclear weapons. So there's this very sort of strange dynamic going on here, which is that the nuclear weapons were on as part of the Ukrainian or were in the Ukrainian geography, but they were not part of the Ukrainian military. They were under Soviet military, Russian Soviet military, SSR command. But then during the breakup of the Soviet Union, the Ukrainian, because everybody left, I mean, basically they ran out of money, they couldn't pay people. So you had this sort of vacuum, this period where the Ukrainians sustained the security and the integrity and the fidelity of those nuclear weapons, and ultimately the goal was to transition them back to the Russian, or what was then the Russian state, or becoming the Russian state. But that was the basis. So that was part of the basis of, in essence, the first negotiated settlement, basically between the Ukrainians and the Russians. And I think there's a huge debate that I don't think anybody really is having right now, which is if if any state was in this position again, would they give up nuclear weapons? And I think the answer is no, because the odds of them being attacked by a peer rival or a near peer rival or super rival is pretty low. And I think that's something that is going to be a challenge going forward with nuclear proliferation and or denuclearization, is that when you kind of look at the game theory behind state survival, clearly nuclear weapons gives you a extremely potent tool in the state survival toolbox, which if you could poll Ukrainians, and would you how many of you would have liked to have kept your nuclear weapons? I'll bet that poll results are pretty high, probably 60-70%. So, and I don't think that's irrational. I think, given what they're going through. So I think that's something to recognize, is that we were in this sort of peace dividend, I'm not going to say kumbaya, but this belief that we were going out of not just the Cold War, the bipolarity of the Cold War, but into this sort of more economic centric, peaceful development phase, and that Ukraine was in essence going to become an early member of that by not being part of the Soviet Union anymore.
So once we get into that sort of, there's a question that there's actually been some reported discussion beginning in some non-nuclear nations that development of nuclear capacity may be wise to forestall different kinds of invasions. How do we feel about that on the panel of that nuclear weapons are an effective deterrent to invasion, effective pursuit for a lot of fledgling countries?
I mean, as an elimination. Oh, go ahead, Greg, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I definitely agree that they are deterrent. There is no question. I mean, that's by the way one of the reasons in Russia right now. One of the points of the propaganda that they had to start this preventive war because Ukraine, along with NATO, were preparing to attack Russia. That's the main argument and of the Russian propaganda. And in truth is, I'm just thinking, like, who would ever think any country, including NATO or United States, to attack a country like Russia with so many nuclear weapons? It's impossible. So it's a absurd idea to begin with, but people believe in that. That's the main official line. But definitely, I believe that nuclear weapons definitely a deterrent.
Yeah, absolutely, and especially for what are called middle states or small states, where there can be a question of state survival, or an existential event like this could happen because they're either a super regional or a global rival. Could be within region as a direct threat. So yeah, I mean, I think just it is, and I believe you're going to get a fairly substantial uptick, maybe not out of the sort of fully developed Western states, but out of other regional states that are becoming economically, developed. Yeah, exactly, and especially in hostile areas. I mean, I just think we're at the end of the day, we're not going to stop the Middle East or whatever we want to call it, the greater, Western Eurasian, Middle Eastern peninsulas from becoming nuclearized. I just think they're all going to be rich enough, they're all going to be technically competent enough, and there's enough of a threat of state survival, and they don't have any cooperative infrastructure in place. And so I just think that one is sort of guaranteed. It's a question of when, not if. And then the question in Asia is, do you move beyond India, Pakistan, Pakistan and China, and then indirectly the United States as a security guarantor to Japan, offering nuclear umbrella, do you move beyond those three and a half, you could say, nuclear powers, and that's like a frozen sort of balance of power, or do you move, or do others jump in? And to me, the big one long term could be Japan, right? If China ever made a substantial enough move in Asia, attempting to take over Taiwan, or something on something at that scale, something that puts a direct threat onto the Japanese mainland, that could be the trigger for something like that. So
just as a slight counterpoint to what we've been talking about, a lot of the difficulty for North Korea and Iran in developing nuclear weapons is that they were signatories to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which most countries in the world are signatories to. So pulling out of that treaty to develop nuclear weapons could be a serious problem. There's also the problem of maintenance of nuclear weapons, which is why as soon as Pakistan had nuclear weapons, the United States swooped in to try and help them secure them in such a way that A, they don't degrade, and B, they don't fall into the hands of less than savory characters who may be less interested in mutually assured destruction.
Yeah, and actually that's a great point, is that, and you look at sort of the Pakistan program, I think that is arguably the template, because it's short range, tactical theater, mobile, in essence, a part of the sort of response framework of nuclear deterrence. It's not part of the first use framework. So it provides a pretty powerful a deterrence, because its primary targeting outside of a few cities is basically the complete military industrial complex of India and its complete territorial and border defense. And so that provides a nuclear balance between Pakistan and India, even though India has probably 5 to 10 times as many nuclear weapons as Pakistan. So I think the Pakistan model is probably going to be the model, and the North Korean model will only be the model for richer states that have a greater distance between perceived or actual threats, because the North Korean model costs a fortune, because you're building ICBMs. I mean, you're basically building a first-tier nation's nuclear force on the cheap, and that's pretty hard to do, given that only maybe 6 have done that.
One of the things I wanted to move on to was the split of Ukraine between West and East, which is really going to play into a lot of Russia's military strategy, I think, at this point in the war. So it's important to sort of flesh that out. You can see this in the election from 2004, in which Viktor Yushchenko, who was the more independence-minded candidate, really prevailed in the Western areas, and Viktor Yanukovych really prevailed in the majority Russian-speaking and areas, which at that time considered themselves Russian ethnic, but at this time may well consider themselves Ukrainian ethnicity. Now, one of the interesting things to sort of point out is how firmly historical this West-East boundary is. If you look, if you add the Hetmanate, which is that area that's sort of pink-gray hashed, and the area that was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, that's that blue area, they roughly match the areas of the West. And if you add the areas that belong to the Russian Empire, to the Ottoman Empire, to the Crimean Khanate, and the Zaporozhian Sich, all those areas seem to match more or less the Russian East. Ukraine politics, pretty much until Euromaidan in 2014, was really divided along this West-East axis. And that may well have continued if Russia didn't invade in 2022 to a greater or lesser extent.
So just wanted to say that this event, this election that was overturned, is called Orange Revolution. And that was the first time that Russia became, pretty much aware that Ukraine is definitely moving towards Europe. I don't know. Do you plan to speak about how it developed?
There you go.
Yeah. So if I say a few more words, so during the 2004, what happened? Viktor Yanukovych and Yushchenko were two opponents, and Yanukovych won the election. However, they started to, saying that this was illegal, that there were a lot of rigging, and there was a lot of, people from European Union got in, and people of Ukraine managed to overturn that election and say, no, that was something happened absolutely wrong there. And they had to do election over second time. And the second time, it is Yushchenko who won that election. Considering that also Yushchenko was poisoned at the time as well to preclude him from running again. Well, nevertheless, he did. He came and he was a Western-oriented president. However, the Russians at that time, in 2004, Putin only been in power 4 years. He was still in the stage of consolidating his power, and he was not prepared to, he hasn't done any kind of military moves. So he used soft power because it's very hard. It's corruption was running very high in Ukraine, and Yushchenko was not very effective in running the country, and using the soft power and influence that Russia still had among this Russian-speaking population. In 2010, at the new election, Viktor Yanukovych won legitimately and came to power. And 4 years later, it led to another revolution.
You bring up a great point, Greg, which is most people presume this sort of hybrid war or, let's say active measures approach started in Georgia in 2008. It really started in Ukraine in 2004. And the West, obviously, nobody really, to be honest, responded, which, we have to be honest about it. I mean, it showed the fact that between not necessarily caring, but also de facto believing that Ukraine was basically in the Russian sphere. I mean, that was the mental state, basically, that almost everybody was in the West. It wasn't just one leader, it wasn't one party, it wasn't one, it was just that was it. And that started to, I think, change with Georgia in 2008. And then as, let's say, a newer generation of leaders came in, there was I think there was a naive belief that Russia was just a regional actor, or this sort of, these sort of tropes of, it's a gas station with nukes or things like that, and not, in essence, trying to delegitimize what Russian global pure power could be, and I think that was obviously a mistake. Even though nobody is admitting that, I mean, I think that's pretty true at this point.
So similar to what Greg had said, the Euromaidan revolution of 2014 happened. And this is when there was an election between Yanukovych, who was that Russian aligned leader who was brought in through Russian state propaganda. That leader was running for re-election in 2014, and he was running against a Western aligned candidate, Petroshenko. And Petroshenko, quote, lost the election, end quote, which led to this large scale uprising throughout Ukraine, but especially concentrated in Maidan Square. The way that Yanukovych tried to overturn this revolution, which was originally peaceful, was through the use of armed police resulting in many Ukrainians going to the hospital with severe injuries, people being locked up and detained. Nevertheless, the revolution persevered, and Yanukovych was thrown out of power and Petroshenko was put into power. Similarly to Yushchenko, Petroshenko was not seen as a very effective ruler, and that led to the election of Zelensky in 2019.
Yeah, good. I'd like to put a little more meat on this because this is what happened on Maidan. It was a earth-shaking event for Ukraine, and really, what happened is it was not. It's not. There was a period between the elections of Petroshenko. What happened with Yanukovych is in 2013, at the very end of it, the European Union offered, because Ukraine people wanted to move towards European Union, away from Russia. So they offered them a big loan and a kind of a path to integration into the European Union. And Yanukovych kind of was saying, yeah, I'm looking into it. It looks, yeah, I'm probably going to go with it. When Putin saw that, he immediately called Viktor Yanukovych, who was actually his puppet, and he heavily depended on Putin. So he brought Yanukovych to Moscow, and he said, no way you're moving towards the European Union. Instead, I'm offering you a better deal. I'm giving you a big loan, and you know, you have to like stop it. You tell him no. He was almost ready to sign that agreement with the European Union. So he came back and he said, no, we have a better deal from Russia, and we're not going with European Union. Instead, we're getting this big loan. And that's what caused the revolt. In a way, it started as only students came out on the Maidan Square, which is the called Square of Independence, and protested. And what Yanukovych did, he put the special forces called Berkut. This is the name of the type of an eagle, against them, and they very brutally kind of went through them. They beat up a lot of students. I think there were like maybe even a couple of deaths, and because. So he brutally suppressed this peaceful, basically, protest. And what happened is that the parents of these students and all other students were enraged by this like thing, you know, that he did. I mean, because they didn't do anything; they just gathered to protest, peaceful protest, you know. And then a lot of people from Kiev started to gather, already adults, already from all kinds of things, and it started to enlarge. So he moved larger forces, and then eventually the whole country, because the country was outraged that he played servant to Russia, and on the brink of having such a major move towards European Union, he canceled this. And the whole country was enraged, but especially enraged by how brutally he acted against the citizens, and that came out. I don't know if anyone of you remember. There were a lot of. It was shown in Western TV. It just erupted in many deaths. It was a great standoff during the winter. At the December of 2013 into January of 2014, and it was horrendous. But eventually, what happened is the Viktor Yanukovych, after a lot of people were killed, a lot of citizens were killed, a lot of civilians. He had a breach in his security force because a lot of people were not very fond of killing their own compatriots. So he had a security breach, and he at some point ran away. He realized that his life is in danger. and he ran away to Crimea first, and then into Russia, where Putin took him. He was an oligarch. He amassed, he stole a lot of money. He is a still very rich man to this day. So, and when he ran, then the temporary government was established. There were no election yet. So they basically were decapitated, and they established a temporary government. And of course there were reaction, because they knew that the Russia is behind all of this, that he acted with such brutality because of a support of Putin. And as a result of this, they were in Rada, which is kind of like a Senate, Ukrainian Senate. They started to talk about canceling Russian language. They started, like, there was an overreaction. And that is the time when Putin took over Crimea by sending troops there and instituting the vote to become part of Russia. I don't know how it would have come out, but certainly when the Russian troops were dominating the Crimea, you cannot count this vote as legitimate. It might have been towards Russia anyway, but who knows? I don't know. But it definitely was not legitimate, and he took over while the government was decapitated. There was no legitimate government. There was a temporary government established. I forgot the names of. There were two major. Yatsenyuk was one of them, right?
And Turchinov, yeah.
And Turchinov, yes, that's right. So and after that, the problem started on the Donbass area. Basically, Russian ex-KGB, specifically a very famous personality called by the name of Igor Girkin, and he has a nickname Strelkov, which means shooter. So he is an ex-KGB officer. He organized, he is very known. He participated in almost all the conflicts, starting from Chechnya, Dniester, in Moldova, and in many places, and including this. And he basically organized people to take over the government in Donbas region, Lugansk and Donetsk. Specifically, he actually, he's still alive. He actually talks about this right now, and told that yes, he was unofficially acting on the orders from Russia, and he brought a lot of people with him, and that's how it's all started. So later on, there was an election in Ukraine. By the way, during the time of Viktor Yanukovych, he imprisoned his opponents. That famous woman, escaped me her name right now. Tymoshenko, yeah, Julia Tymoshenko. Now she came out of prison. There was an election, and at this point, Poroshenko won the election. But Poroshenko obviously was another oligarch. And not much changed. I mean, even though it was started to be more and more pro-Western.
I would argue he was a pro-Ukrainian oligarch. I think that might be a better way to put it.
You could say. Yeah. Well, I'm talking in terms of the major problem in Ukraine was the corruption.
Yeah, of course.
And he did nothing to reduce that, because that's what's the disappointment of the people was about that. All right. Just wanted to eliminate, this is a major event, the Maidan situation, and how it all went, and how at the time of the weakness, Putin decided to take over. I mean, there was no commander of the armies. I mean, when there was no like central command. There was like this is the way Crimea was taken, and even though it's a Russian-speaking area, and maybe a lot of people consider themselves ethnically Russian, I don't think they would want to the majority of population would want to necessarily become part of Russia without that move.
So, Greg, you bring up a really good point here, which I think is often missed as a sort of an early warning signal, is that in 2014, obviously Russia, both directly and through proxy, in essence, invaded or had a limited war aims within Ukraine itself. Basically, Donbass and Luhansk are parts of it. I mean, ideally, if there was no resistance, they would have taken over all of that and Crimea. But the thing I think that's really important is that the Ukrainians were completely dysfunctional from a defensive perspective, much less having offensive capabilities. And they were able to sort of engineer a frozen conflict in Donbass and Luhansk, sort of, kind of almost entrepreneurially. And and maintain that basically. And obviously, after 2014, they started getting slowly, and then it accelerated Western support, some military support, training, let's say reorganization, et cetera. But the fact that the Ukrainians, who were in on paper, a far inferior position, could basically sustain a frozen conflict on the border region with Russia, that really should have been a signal to everybody that the Russians were not going to go from a force and capability that could not defeat, in essence, a very regionalized partisan sort of entrepreneurial, almost like a Hezbollah type force. I don't mean politically, but I mean sort of capability, right? Small arms, small units. There weren't brigade and division size, units in 2014, 2015, 2016 that were in Eastern Ukraine, and the fact that the Russians could not defeat them, that they would go from where they were in 2014 to 2022 and be able to have a truly regional expeditionary superpower army that could try to take, half of Ukraine over in a sort of shock and awe campaign, that the likelihood of that was nil. Even though I think everyone's analysis going into the conflict, 4 months ago, or 3 months, 4 months ago, was that the Russians should be able to take over Ukraine in a matter of days. They can knock out Kiev, et cetera, et cetera. I think anyone that sort of read what they did in 2014 and the proportional commitment they had from that period to today, meaning the size of the forces they had to sustain that conflict to the size they have today, we're not talking orders of magnitude, right? It's not 40 times the forces. It's 5 to maybe 8, 9 times the forces. So the idea that force could take over literally half of this picture on a screen was always sort of, to me, very ridiculous. It just didn't.
So,
it didn't
before we get further into this, there's sort of 2 questions. Mm-hmm. Did the Obama administration have anything to do with the success or failure of Euromaidan, especially Victoria Nuland?
Yeah,
I actually would like to address that.
Me too. You go first.
Okay. Again, there are 2 sides always. The justification for taking Crimea and the situation on Donbass from Russian perspective was, first of all, Crimea had a strategic importance because of the Russian fleet was based in Sevastopol. It was a contract with Ukraine that the Russians felt threatened that it would be taken away. And this base would be taken from them. So there was one reason why Russians felt justified strategically to take over. However, the Russian perspective was that the Maidan was orchestrated by United States, NATO, and Banderovцы. You remember the neo-Nazis, okay? And the thing is that, yes, of course, United States supported it, and Victoria Nuland, who was the advisor to Obama, was there and was definitely encouraging this. And it is true. Also, there were elements of Nazis from Western Ukraine there as well. That there are some documentary about that. Now the question is whether they were as Russia claimed, they were the major factors that really made this revolution happen. I mean, so I personally trying to be, I was born and grew up in Moscow. Of course, I lived most of my life here in the West, but I'm trying to look at this objectively. And yes, it was a presence. In my opinion, they're not the ones who made that happen. People of Ukraine made that happen. In my opinion, they were minor components of that. And it would have happened even without their help. That's my opinion. I feel very strongly about that. So that's the important question.
Yeah, I mean, I agree 85% of your sort of belief of it happening. I do think, like, just trying to be a little more macro about this, is that the post-Cold War era or post-H.W. Bush era, basically United States foreign policy until basically Trump has been a completely Wilsonian policy. Basically freedom, democracy, promotion, etc. I'm not linking it to the achievements. I'm not linking it to. I'm talking aims. I'm talking aims, philosophy, sort of almost aspirations. And so when you look at Russian actions in Europe, everywhere, but especially in Europe in the 2000s, this happened during a Wilsonian project in Iraq, basically, that the US had. And at the same time that Europe basically decided to treat Russia like a gas station, basically, and said, well, they might get difficult once in a while, but whatever. I mean, there was sort of the whatever phase, and in German policy is the essence of that, right? I mean, you could argue that it was just a complete German complicity with supporting Russian economic aims in Europe for decades, and the Germans are struggling to get to the other side of that, and I'd say get into where the world is in 2022. But so the reason this is important is it lays the foundation to the question, which is when Obama came in and Hillary Clinton was his Secretary of State, that there was this belief that the US needed to rebalance its priorities to Asia and deprioritize sort of the Cold War thinking of Russian, American, European balance of power, classic North problems, and it, in essence, I mean, it stated this it sort of ham-fisted level, where even then President Obama said during a conference that Putin was at and other Europeans that Russia is a regional power, which was a known goal. Even if you believe that, you don't say it in that type of event. And you could argue that was a triggering event, sort of unnecessary, but it was really stated policy in the United States. And Secretary Clinton, who you could argue was a fairly aggressive Secretary of State towards Russian sort of threats, but I would just say didn't necessarily back that up with the kind of coalitional development you would have needed to counter those threats. I think that would be a fair reading of it. So you had this. So Nolan didn't just fall off a truck on a Wednesday, right? Like she came in as part of this shift in philosophy, and I'd say that philosophy continued, even after Obama, really, to some degree. And I think now, does that justify anything the Russians have done? Of course not. But I think it set the table in a lot of ways for how and why the Russians think the way they do about this.
So one more question just to address. There's a question: wasn't Zelensky's Ukrainian anti-corruption reputation first developed by playing a television character, specifically vocalizing those stances, thereby vocalizing and strengthening the desire among some people, some portion of the Ukrainian population? And that's why I opened up on this slide. Yes, it helps that when you play a character who runs for president on the purpose of decreasing corruption, and then you actually run for president on the purpose of decreasing corruption, that it works as almost propaganda for your run. And that's what Zelensky did. What's great is that he was actually able to capitalize on that, and once in the presidency showed that he actually had the mettle to be a president.
Yeah. One other quick point here, because Patty brings it up, is that this was not a Democrat or Republican thing in America. You had Wilsonians on both sides. So John McCain was absolutely one of them. And so you've had this, this is not new, right? You've had this battle in American foreign policy between Wilsonians and realists and Atlanticists and post-Atlanticists. It's like religion almost. It's a bunch of fragmentation. But the implications of this is that it determines the emphasis that the United States and arguably the Atlantic Alliance and the Atlantic powers will put on Russia or not on Russia as a threat, like within a threat matrix and a set of priorities. And the reason this is important, and there's a last quick point here, is that everybody knows that the US is the only capable expeditionary combat power protector and guarantor of security in Europe. The French, the Turks, the UK, they have expeditionary combat power, and they're sort of a mini version of us, but they're not integrated together that way. And so they're sort of as independent actors, so they can go and defend a state, but they could not defend a region across Europe. And so the US acts as that umbrella defender, and that is what NATO really is. So people need to understand NATO is not an army. NATO is not a country. NATO is a management system. Think of it as like McKinsey for the military. And there's basically a coordinated command and control system, and then individual nations provide forces either together or independently to missions. And so when the US decides to de-emphasize something at a continent level scale, the implications are substantial, especially over decades. And I would argue that's a consequence in the post-Cold War era. Across all the Wilsonian presidents, regardless of party, basically.
Right. So one of the things is that I've always addressed what the current situation of Ukraine is in the maps. And while there are some differences between the 5th of March and 27th of March, the last two presentations we did, the maps on those days, there's a massive difference between 27th of March and where we are today at the 7th of May. And I want to just flip between those slides very quickly so you can see the key differences. The key, one of the points, right, and 27th of March, I don't know if we can remember way back when, but in those heady days, the Russians were trying to surround Kiev, and you can see the pincer movement around Kiev. You can see Kiev right here, where I'm showing with the laser pointer. You can see the Russians are approaching from the north on the Belarusian side. You can also see that they're approaching from the east. And many times going around cities. What the Ukrainians were doing was very intentionally forcing the Russians to meet them in cities where the size difference between the forces doesn't count for much, and where the Russian supply lines are incredibly extended, so those Russian supply lines can be easily attacked.
Yeah, and I think one other very important point to this is that the Russian invasion, I'd say the first phase of it, which is probably through this period, was basically a sort of a weird version of a venture startup. It was like half a dozen different, sort of separate invasions by different commands from different area commands, uncoordinated and sort of in conflict with each other. And of course, most of those failed. I mean, and I don't mean just failed a little, but were basically abysmal failures. And the Russians in the last 5 weeks have basically reorganized into, let's say, 1.5 commands at this point. And I think this is really important to understand when you're in a long war. And I think a lot of commentators really never discussed it this way, but I think it's true that this is just a long war. This is as long of a war as the Russians want to have. So if the Russians want to have it as a long war, it'll be a long war. And at this point, there you have all the intentions look like it's a long war. Is that when your initial aims and capabilities are wrong, whether it's here or whether it was a U.S. invasion in Iraq, and what it would take to actually, pacify and or reduce the conflict, that reorientation, it doesn't happen in days and weeks. It happens in months. It took the U.S. about 9 months after the first 5-6 months, which is how long it took for them to realize that the initial war aims were incorrect around capabilities. And so by the time they reoriented to what would have been a smarter invasion, they were 18 months in, and the situation on the ground had changed so many times that you could never catch up. So the Russians, after about a month-ish, realized that their initial war aims were incorrect, and now they're reorienting to what I would argue should have been their original war aims. I'm not justifying it. I'm saying, in terms of their perspective. And I think they're probably still a month away, maybe 2, from positioning themselves for what would have been more effective February 24th. The question is, in that 3-month period, is that enough time for the Ukrainians to fully reorient themselves to defeat the Russians based on what the new aims will be, which will be completely to the east and the south? I would argue this will just be a far more powerful conventional 2014, or a continuation of the 2014 war, but at an amplification, basically.
Exactly right. So if we look here at the 8th of May map, you can see the Ukrainians basically pushing the Russians out, and the Russians were retreating from their siege on Kiev. Zhytomyr region, let me point. The Zhytomyr region here, Kiev region, all of these regions here have noted that there's no more Russian troops, and those Russian troops, as Aaron has said, are concentrating along this eastern area. If we look and compare, Russia is penetrating more and more successfully in this eastern part here, and we also see, while the Ukrainians are preventing them from taking the city of Mykolaiv, which is over here, the Russians were able to take the city of Mariupol after a long and devastating siege of the city.
Yeah, and I think there's going to be, we're going to be in this test zone in the next 30 to 60 days, which is all of the modern artillery that the Ukrainians are acquiring, both from the U.S. and allies, which is hundreds of pieces, plus their re-maintenance of their existing pieces, they're going to be bringing to the east. And so you're looking at, arguably 50 to 100 batteries of fairly modern artillery, and the real test for me is going to be, can the Ukrainians organize themselves in a way that they can create larger mass of forces, division level forces, and can the Russians, or will the Russians be able to organize mass level forces at the brigade division level? Because one thing about this conflict that's not talked about, I don't think anywhere, is the fact that the design unit of this conflict has been a battalion, which is a sort of strange designed unit size for a large scale conventional mechanized armor and infantry
Strange
war.
in that it's small.
Strange in that it's ridiculously small, like almost weird. And the fact that, the Russians double down, triple down on that size of a unit for, 2 months now. And the Ukrainians are shifting into brigade size units. But once again, this is not something that, it's not maps, it's not PowerPoints, it's not whiteboards. Like, the effort to get good at a brigade size unit is measured in years, usually, maybe a decade. So trying to do it in a few months means it's going to be clunky. And so the question is, can the Ukrainian clunky brigades beat this sort of mosh pit of Russian battalions? And will the Russians at some point decide to organize into brigade and division units? Because if they did, I really do believe, because they have about 100, the Ukrainians have about 120 battalions that are spread across the East. And I think that's a fundamental problem Ukrainians have. The Ukrainians are in this sort of defend everything mode. I really don't believe that should be their strategy. I actually think they should trade space for time and density. If the Ukrainians could construct 6 to 8 divisions, 2 or 3 corps, I think they could basically destroy the Russian army. And I don't mean piecemeal. I mean, this would be a cataclysmic historic defeat of the Russian army, because they would just have so much density. Now, to do that, they would be walking away from maybe 2/3 of this map, but the Russians wouldn't have the ability to counter. Now, we could argue we might not want in the West that to happen because we're afraid of the Russian escalatory dynamics. And that might be true. But if you're speaking from the Ukrainian perspective, that's someone else's problem until you get calls from every president and prime minister.
I want to push a little bit on this that you've mentioned, where Ukraine is trying to defend all points. Isn't it, because given Ukraine's smaller size and the way that they've historically won in this conflict is by forcing the Russians into cities, wouldn't it be, isn't that the strategy that Ukraine should continue to pursue of defending the cities that seem to be
this gets back to a philosophy issue. So I'm a center of gravitist, which is a concept in military strategy. So I believe in center of gravity. Some people don't. Some people believe in much more of a maximalist sort of approach.
Define these two terms.
Yeah. So think of a center of gravity as the thing in whatever you are in conflict with. It could be in business, it could be in almost any situation. It's sort of it's a stratagem. It came from von Clausewitz originally, and it was meant to be used sort of in the Napoleonic through the great wars of the 19th century, where you are basically defining where the most important aspect of your enemy is, whether it's their political support, whether it's their alliance support, whether it's their people support, whether it's the masses of their forces, whether it's their navy, whatever that is. And you confront that to, in essence, destabilize that enemy. And that destabilization, if it is significant enough, sows chaos in their decision-making rubric and in their leadership, that it foments or begins a collapse. And if you had in essence, rolling campaign of CG, of center of gravity, you would, in essence, create within the enemy sort of a forced collapse. That's the operating theory. And when applied in history, where it's been extremely surgically targeted, it has I think, pretty decent outcome versus maximalists, which is, fight everywhere, fight everything. You have to be a believer of, we almost like a winism, sort of like an optimism, winning optimism. And the center of gravity doesn't take that. Or people who believe more in these sort of strategic aims try to depersonalize that and try to achieve this more in a rational approach. And I believe the way the Russians have spread their forces out, because the thing we have to realize, just because there's a little box that says a BTG, a battalion tactical group on the map, doesn't mean that that area they're in, which might be 20 square kilometers, that there is Russian armed forces in every little, nook and cranny of that area. There isn't. And so these are areas with huge amounts of open space. So the Russians are just so spread out that if the Ukrainians concentrated forces, they would attain so much mass. And when you have these light forces, and when we emphasize how light these forces are, these battalions are supposed to be 700 to 1,000. Most of them are 400 to 600. And within that group, the amount that are actually combat infantry is probably closer to 100 or 80. So, these BTGs are so light that if they got attacked by any kind of significant mass, they would just be overrun. And I think, but this is a big philosophical decision. And the question is, are the Ukrainians thinking like this? And is the West encouraging them?
Right. The question you seem to be asking is, are the Ukrainians willing to sacrifice, let's say, two-thirds of Ukrainian territory, so that way they have the Russians spread out far enough that they can sort of create an avalanche ball of all the Ukrainians who've retreated to that point, and then move that avalanche ball through all these low-density Russian positions.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And the last quick piece of this is that given the amount of artillery they're bringing in, both from the West and their own, and basically restructuring it, they will have the ability to mass such deep fires, fires meaning like artillery fire, in density that, this is sort of like a Gulf War I scenario, really, to be honest, where it's the Ukrainians could become a version of what the US was in the first Gulf War, where the Iraqis were defending this enormous space from Kuwait to a third of the way up the Saudi-Iraqi border peninsula area.
Right. Now, the question that I've had, and I can't seem to find a satisfactory answer anywhere, is why is Ukraine, with the exception of that one hit that they did in Russia about a week and a half ago or so, why is Ukraine not either invading Russia or trying to topple the Belarusian government and have sort of a quasi-puppet state to the north?
Yeah, look, there is this, and this is another thing that I think is a very high escalation risk in this conflict, is that the idea, and maybe this is the reason the Ukrainians aren't able to create the density, there is potentially an idea that the central government in Ukraine doesn't have the complete authority over all their forces. It's a much more loose federation of command, and the risk there is that, especially in the Far East, those Ukrainian forces that have been there for 10 years, or people from those regions that have family on the Russian side and the whole nine yards, so they know the border region. These are people who can sneak across or penetrate the Russian side, I think with impunity, given the scale of this border region we're talking about. It's almost 1,000 nearly 1,000 kilometers when you count the Belarusian side and the Ukrainian side of it. And so sneaking small units across, or extremists that have small unit sort of intentions, I don't think is difficult. I think at this point, the Ukrainian discipline has been significant enough that they haven't done this. But to me, there is a scenario. I'm not saying it's very high, but if the Russians started threatening or having far more catastrophic civilian casualties, the Ukrainians could respond with, in essence, sort of like a Hezbollah, Hamas style attack vector into Russia. And there's so many soft targets, it just would be, it could pull off anything. You can't, a Ukrainian, as Greg could point out, walking around Russia doesn't look Ukrainian, right? So, there's no meaning to that. So their ability to function, as a threat actor in Russia is sort of with impunity. And I think that is a very high risk going forward as this becomes a longer conflict. And I think one of the reasons the Russians are attempting to contain this to Ukraine is that they want to keep this a special military operation. They want to, or this is their terms, they want to keep it a, in essence, an optional war that doesn't have, outside of economic costs, high costs on the Russian people. If you started getting attacks in Russia, substantial attacks, then there's no way that happens anymore. That triggers an escalation.
Right, but then I'm seeing.
But there are some attacks. There are some attacks.
Well, no. One-off attacks aren't the same as multi-vector attacks.
It's not a major, but there are some attacks. There are fires in Bryansk, in Kursk. And so they don't know. Some of it may be conducted by drones or maybe helicopters, but some may be sabotage. So there are some stuff going on,
but it's very border. It's very adjacent to the conflict.
But the main thing is that tomorrow is a very important day. As you know, it's a victory day for Russia, and
hey guys, before we get to the tomorrow's day, I think we didn't address. We don't have that much time to address the atrocities by Russian troops. Anybody can talk about it? The Bucha, particularly. What is happening, and if anybody was privy to to a lot of the news, and do they know any kind of inside information or stuff like that? It's just very disheartening to me.
Yeah, I don't know if it's. We all know what happened. I don't know what can be added to what happened.
The only thing I would say is that this is now moving into the criminal. And I'm sure Richard could speak a little bit to this too, into sort of the pre-UN, but it's really the EU Court of Justice and Human Rights Council on the EU, where they're going through this sort of evidentiary phase, and so I think that will be a big deal. Actually, I think there's going to be a huge amount of it's going to take time. It's not going to happen, in a matter of days and weeks, or probably even months. But I think long term, that piece of it will be massive, because you're dealing with a huge amount of Russians involved in these events, right? Especially there's probably hundreds of these across eastern Ukraine. So you're dealing with.
What can you cannot bring those Russians to justice.
No,
you have to conquer the country.
No,
but it's already
totally
swayed.
Right. Yeah.
It's already swayed the public opinion, and as a result, the Ukraine getting much more help, which is definitely a thing. But I don't know, Richard, you may want to speak about this, but honestly, I don't know.
Sure.
Before we address this question, one more question. I apologize. The troops, Russian troops, are coming back at a body bag home. How much of the opinion would it sway over Russians? And something, Richard, you can also apply. So,
I don't know how much effect the body bags are going to have, to be honest. The percentage of Russians who have family who are involved in the war itself is probably not large enough to dissuade the larger propaganda. Remember, American body bags coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan weren't painful because they were body bags. They were body bags for people where we didn't know why they were dying. In Russia, there's a very coherent narrative as to why these people are dying. It's a false narrative, but it's a coherent one. So
that's right.
So there's that. But on what happened in Bucha, the problem isn't so much that the atrocities occurred. We have pretty conclusive satellite imagery that shows that it was Russians who committed these acts, and that those Russians were informed by their senior commanders. But genocide has two legal prongs. The first prong is an action designed to eliminate or otherwise an ethnic group, racial group, whatever. And the second prong is that there's the intentionality to achieve that end, right? It's not just that Ukrainians are being killed, but Ukrainians are being killed with the purpose of removing Ukrainians from that piece of land.
Yeah.
And it's that intentionality that's really difficult to parse out here. We don't have, at least as far as I've seen, clear statements from the Russian command saying, we want to remove Ukrainians from this territory. We think Ukrainians no longer deserve to exist. These kinds of statements. They'll say things like Ukraine is not a country. Ukraine should be part of Russia, but not that the Ukrainians themselves should be removed. And so that is what creates difficulty in the legal community with accepting the definition of genocide, regardless of whether politicians want to use that word to describe the severity of the massacres. It's in much the same way that people will use the word racism to describe, for example, bigotry against people because of their religion, or bigotry against people because of their ethnic group, even though the term racism is specifically about skin color, right? Because the hurt of the word racism informs the way people think about that crime. And racism sounds worse than bigotry, even though it is functionally the same thing in terms of the degree of pain, but we hear it differently. And so,
yeah, and you bring up a great point around genocide, or the use of the term. And in reality, what we're trying to say is these are war crimes, but war crimes seem so uniform and universal that we're attempting, we don't have language, something I've argued for a long time in this modern world. We have this very kind of static language that made sense in the past, but we're missing words to convey of like a phasal shift of something. And so this is definitely war crimes, but it's plus, there's something else. But the legal definition of genocide, which is a pretty tough thing to prove, I mean, my guess is we have in the West, between the UK and the US and the French, enough signals intelligence, but we're not going to release that signals intelligence because that would give away methods and tools and so on. So my guess is there's probably enough of that information there that if you wanted to prosecute commanders, you wanted to build cases against people, you will have. And I'm sure we might release some of the more low level signals intelligence that doesn't compromise methods in the West.
For those who might not be familiar, signals intelligence is when the military or spy satellites or whatever overhears information that's being shared over networks. So they might intercept an email transmission, a radio transmission, a televised transmission that would otherwise be encoded.
That's right. And another aspect of the 2014 failure to win that was pretty obvious going into this conflict is the fact that which is pretty surprising, but the degrading of the Russians' communications management, signals intelligence, signals management, operational security is, I would argue, almost historic for an advanced modern military. The fact that they just don't have functional military communications is such a fundamental thing, right? It's like saying you don't have any medical care. I mean, it's right up there. And, you wouldn't start a conflict. I don't mean a guerrilla war or a partisan war, but you wouldn't start a large scale conventional conflict where you're likely to take lots of casualties and not have any medical care available. But it seems like the Russians did that, with lots of their domains, lots of the aspects of modern military, they did that. I have a bunch of material on the military, and I have a bunch of material on the economy of Ukraine. And so my goal was to kind of cover both of those and go through kind of Q&As with anybody that on those, if that's what you so wish.
Yeah, and if you have questions, please put your questions in the chat. We won't, I guess, based on this, we won't have an independent Q&A period, and we'll answer the questions as they come. So tell me a little bit about these will to fight factors.
Yeah, so there's a really great analysis that's been put together by the Institute of War as part of the War College, the U.S. Army War College, and there's basically an analytical framework around what your degree of commitment is, and and where your status is once that degree of commitment has been tested. So if you go back one slide, I think you go back one slide there. No, okay, no, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah, so go forward. Sorry, yeah, that's fine. So yeah, so actually, this is probably a better one to start with, and then I'll go backwards to the first figure. But so when you look at all of these qualities, let's say, ideology, people's individual identity, what the quality of your forces are, what the expectations are, unit competence, support, the degree of training, you have the doctrine, which we were talking about a little earlier, organizational leadership, civil military relations, state support strategy, leadership, societal support, the mission itself, what's your adversary's performance, equipment, what's the messaging, and what the allies are. So when you kind of evaluate, the Russians' will to fight in northern Ukraine, so this was in northern Ukraine before they retreated, which I think at this point you would see this as the same, basically probably in eastern Ukraine or very close to it. I do think Crimea is different. I've always argued that. I think, and we've had these discussions before, and Richard has had this fantastic series on basically on the history of the Middle East and Ottomans, and big discussions on Byzantium. I think Crimea.
Just
go
a
ahead.
quick note,
Please.
that's for those of you who may be interested in hearing more about that, that's episode 27 of my Middle Eastern history series. Please continue.
Yep, exactly. And so I think Crimea represents, I've always argued, it's sort of like the Hawaii of the United States as a forward projection of power for Russia, in that it's their warm water port. It gives them the ability to project power out of the Black Sea, in essence, attempt to turn the Black Sea into a Russian lake, or at least a co-lake with the Turks. And Turkey, let's put it this way, Turkey isn't against that. They might not be for it, but they're just not against it. And so that's enough for the Russians to have achieved that. And so I've always felt Crimea is a true red line for the Russians. And I think everyone rational accepts that. And I actually think even the Ukrainians do at this point, because it's the return on investment for Crimea, for Ukraine, is not measurable compared to what the Russians are willing to invest and lose for Crimea. So I do think the will to fight factors for Crimea are radically different than they would be for the North, for sure. And then I would say even the East over time, especially as the Ukrainian resistance has been so substantial for 8 years in the East. So when you look at these, and this was the analysis, that especially when it comes to adversarial performance, equipment, messaging, allies, that if you're part of the Russian force, you realize like this is you against the world at this point. And so that is, I think, pretty uniform when it comes to the Russians. And if you sort of flip to the other side, which is the Ukrainian will to fight, which is the slide before. Oh, yeah, there it is. The Ukrainian will to fight. And I actually argue that since this was, a month and a half ago, that these numbers are trending higher, actually, not lower. I don't think the Russian numbers are trending lower either. I think the Russian numbers are probably pretty static, but I think the Ukrainian numbers are. So I think desperation is whatever, 8, 9, 10, 11, pick a number. Revenge, I think this was my earlier point around the risk of escalation dynamics. I think the revenge in the East is substantial. I think it was always there. And I think after this invasion, especially the atrocities, the war crimes, I think that's that's going to be a big test for the Ukrainians. I think there is this dynamic in this conflict where, and you see this with smaller powers or lesser powers when it comes to their military capacity, that they don't rotate forces very effectively. I think this is going to be an opportunity for the Ukrainians. It's going to be a test of their integrated command. Is do they start rotating forces? Because number one, if you're fighting for 30, 60, 90 days, you reach a point of exhaustion. You basically reach a point of diminishing returns in your forces. And so I think the opportunity to sort of spin out of the revenge and also, let's say, co-integrate their forces better is to start rotating forces. So moving forces from west to east, north to south, you start creating a much more unified Ukrainian ground forces army, not a regional territorial force. I think that's going to be a critical thing long-term, to be honest, and not just long-term for this conflict, long-term for Ukrainian security, basically.
I think this sort of goes back to the question that I had about the Azov battalion, in that Ukraine's struggle right now, right, as you've encapsulated it, is that there are numerous different militia groups that are all united in the same objective and may or may not listen to commands from Kiev. It seems that they're relatively responsive at this point, but it's not the same as having a unified military leadership with a national agenda that pursues national aims at the request of the government. And that collectivization, if we can call it that, of those various militias into one unified structure. Yep. That's really going to be the test for Ukraine.
Yeah, and to be honest, it's going to be the determinant of whether Ukraine becomes more than just this sort of arms depot with a civil war against Russia going on. If it becomes a true modern component of European defense, because you could make an argument at this point that right now on Earth, Ukraine is becoming go back. Oh, you just started flipping slides.
Yeah.
Where are you?
Yeah.
Okay.
I like
no, go ahead. No. Do what you want to do.
Yeah.
That's fine. That Ukraine at this point is right now, I would say, the second most. I'd probably say tied with Israel. Maybe they're right up there. It's probably the second most capable land warfare force in the world right now, or they'd be in that top tier because they're proving it on the ground every day. I mean, they're actually, this isn't training anymore. This is real, and they are dynamically adjusting. The question is, that works during existential survival, but once you get into a long frozen conflict, now you have to actually organize yourself as a modern, military, and all of the bureaucratic administrative components and organizational principles, which I think the Ukrainians are fully capable of doing. It's a question of, is this something they're able to pull off? Because it's going to mean over time adjusting, rotating, and delegitimizing sort of war hero regional commanders, almost warlords. And that is the challenge, is how do you find new roles for them, that they contribute, but you take away their sort of cult of personality on the battlefield. So
we have one question in the comments. If Russia decided to use a tactical nuke in Ukraine, what do we expect the West's response would be? What do we expect the international response would be?
So two things. I think, sadly, the media doesn't cover the escalation ladder. The escalation ladder is people shooting at each other and nuclear bombs. And there's a lot of steps, dozens of them, before you get there. And I just think objectively, between either the national security, what's called the blob, I should say, media and or the participants, I just think they've either been naive, ignorant, or lazy, and not breaking, because it's kind of sensational to talk nukes, right? It's just like nukes. You just say the words a lot, and and it has a a resonance, where it's not very cool and neat. It's boring to start talking about all these little micro escalation steps. I think there is a huge number of these escalation steps before anything gets you to a nuclear deployment, for a multitude of reasons. The closer the participants are to each other in a contested battle space, that makes artillery even hard to use oftentimes. You're not going to be deploying tactical or theater nuclear weapons. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, just at a military level, at a risk level, at everything, right? It's not functional to you. You're not going to, it's not a video game. You're not going to dump it on the breadbasket and try to, irradiate wheat, right? I mean, so when you start looking at where it's feasibility, you're not going to dump it on Kyiv and kill 1 million people, right? So when you start looking at what would be, you're not going to dump it on NATO. You're not. So the optionality of it is I argue almost non-existent at a certain point, because it doesn't.
There is also a point of mobilization. I mean, that's what tomorrow everybody is looking for, whether total or maybe partial, because it's already probably happening in Russia, and whether they're going to announce an all-out war. And you can't discount the total population of Russia. It's a major component.
You're totally right. I don't buy the total war thesis, primarily because it's a dominant. All human amplified social media escalations are the dominant media profile in every aspect of life now. And I just don't buy that maximalist kind of answer to everything that goes on in the world. I just don't, because right now it's in Putin's interest to keep this a limited war, a special operation. Now he could keep it a special operation and have what you'd kind of call mobilization on the cheap, which he's already doing. They're already doing this. They're basically paying people for contracts 3 to 6 times as much money as normally being paid. So they can keep doing that and build sort of a half-baked mobilization. I think they'll keep doing that because the people who will do it are volunteers. They'll use their conscripts as backfill for their other military jobs, and they'll offer their best conscripts, or the ones that are motivated for this, the option of a contract. And then that is how they get out of conscripts don't fight there. They're all contract fighters. And just so you realize that most people don't understand this, but it's pretty typical in the rest of the world that have conscript forces, that there are conscripts that just rotate in for a year or maximum 2. And then there are what's called the contract force. And the contract force are people on longer term contracts. They tend to make up the cadre force, like the core of that military. So, and Russia runs itself like that. Arguably, it's one of the mistakes they made from 2014 is they did not substantially increase their contract force. And to make this point, which just speaks to how absurdly prepared they were for this, they had a higher amount of contractors at one point during the Syrian conflict when they were involved there than they did at the beginning of this conflict. So they were so grossly mismatched with the amount of force they needed, and capable force they could have had, that this was, it's actually amazing they didn't lose more than they did already, basically, so far.
Yeah.
But the prospects of this war at this point, at the current levels, are not in favor of Russia. So something has to be changed.
Yeah.
So, okay, if you discount the nuclear, which I understand, I agree with, then there have to be some change, because Putin doesn't want to lose this war. Yeah. So, what I hear is that there is unofficial conscript already going on from the distant regions, not from the big cities.
Absolutely.
And that they're training them. I think it started like in April 1st.
Yeah.
And it takes time. Also, they have very vast reserves of weapons from Soviet times that they kind of frozen at this point, but it's almost unlimited.
So you bring up a great point, Greg. So by the way, Richard, if you can go back to those 2 slides just for a quick minute, because there's something that I wanted to show you guys, which I think was important. So the Russians have a material advantage. The Ukrainians have a people advantage, and they're attempting to catch the material up. So this is the race that they both have. So I think one thing to recognize is when you deal with individual competence and unit competence, if you see that 4 or 5 rows down, the grade is basically a 4 and a 5. These numbers don't move quickly. These numbers take quarters, 3 months, 6 months to years to move up. And as you move up in higher numbers, it take longer. So, and to the point that, a lot of people don't realize that you would see objectively in the United States, probably no more than 25% of the forces, maximum, would have a 9. Probably another 25 to 30% would have an 8. And then another, and these are active duty forces. The rest of the active duties would be probably 7 with a tiny number of 6s. And then when you got to the reserve forces, it would be more like 4, 5, 6, and 7s, and a handful, tiny number of 8s, mostly 7s. It would be as high as you get. So even in a force that is, the U.S. spends more on training than everybody by an average of 2x, and in some units 4, 6, 7x. And your training competence is, you train like you fight, right? It's like anything in life. You practice like you play in a sport or playing chess or whatever you do. And so I think the individual unit competence is a piece here. That once they move all of the pieces around the table, they get all the material, all the human capital, all the fighters, everything laid out. Everything falls back to that individual and unit competence. It just does. And then the commander capability to leverage that. And that's where often conflicts degrade into a frozen conflict, is that the individual and unit competence and the command competence is so aligned that there's just no breakthrough there, because there's nothing can mobilize ahead of the other or sustain that mobilization. And I do think that's a significant risk here, to be honest.
One of the things that I wanted to talk about is because I rarely hear anything about the economics, and you did an incredible amount of work galvanizing these slides together.
Sure.
So I thought perhaps we could talk a little bit about
absolutely. I can jump into this, and if Greg has seen some of these before, you just jump in also. So I put a bunch of sort of slides together around, and most of it's from Bloomberg and Bloomberg Business Week and some Wall Street Journal and just kind of the financial publications, the FT, et cetera, that basically break down the regional economy and because that is a functional input to this over time. So the Black Sea breadbasket, when you look at the global grain trade, which I think most people aren't aware of how substantial Argentina is either, or Canada, or the U.S. So objectively, the Americas, this is not a war that will have any impact on grain or food production in the Americas. It might have commodity price impact because traded commodity goods are on markets. And so you don't buy necessarily, you can't buy Argentinian commodity at tonnage levels. You buy what they put on the global market, just like oil in many cases. But when it comes to places like Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, even China to some degree, the impact of this because of Ukraine and Russia is going to be substantial. Because you are taking, it's sort of like the first Gulf War, or even maybe the second one where you were taking Iraq. It's sort of like the first one where you were taking Iraq Kuwaiti production off the market, and the Saudi production went down too because they were mobilizing for war, and so you really took an enormous amount of oil energy capacity off the market. Let's say about 20%, let's say 10% to 20%. And I think that's a similar dynamic. One thing that has not been done in if you hear about it, no one's talked about this either, because I don't think anyone wants to do this, is nobody's talking about embargoing Russian grain, because obviously the food security implications of that would be catastrophic. So what there is a a reduction in Ukrainian production, and I think this is a very important thing to understand about the breadbasket. You don't just show up and wheat is on the ground and you pick it, right? It's not a National Geographic movie about humans 7,000 years ago, right? And so you have a planting season. There's a complete industrialization around this: storage, depots, logistics, shipping. Most grain is shipped by sea, unless out of the Ukraine, it's going by train into Central Western Europe. And so with the Black Sea now in the position it's in, you have most of that shipping, if not all that shipping, is gone. Yeah. And so you've had a complete reduction or elimination. And just like oil in many ways, or other energy, or other commodities for that matter, large scale commodities, most commodities are bought in contracts. So you buy short-term, medium, or long-term contracts. You buy long-term contracts because you believe you're going to lock in a price and you want the stability of delivery. You buy short-term contracts because you think you're smarter than you probably really are, and you think you can arbitrage the market to find what you need. And maybe if you're a small country, you can pull that off. If you're Egypt, you probably don't want to do that. You probably want to have long-term contracts locked in. So something that hasn't really been
I was actually going to say, related to that, because you had brought up food security and how a lot of these countries in the Middle East, Africa, have long-term contracts to secure their food supply. What a lot of people forget about Arab Spring is that Arab Spring was not brought on by, for example, we talked about Euromaidan, which was about voting policy and about long-term economic orientation. The reason Arab Spring happened was primarily because of food security issues. The price of rice was escalating, the price of wheat was escalating, people didn't have the ability to feed themselves. And so the lack of food security could be an immense disruptor throughout North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Middle East.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the main disruption you have right now is so Russia. If there's one thing Russia has done, if you're being objective, has been brilliant at, is managing its central bank, and we'll get into that, and its financial architecture, because the West threw basically a equivalent of a financial nuclear bomb on Russia, and they've weathered it. Now, one of the things the Russians have done is they have not broken any of their commodity contracts with non-European states that have not already sanctioned them. So the main gap you have is anyone that had Ukrainian contracts in the world. And I would argue that an aspect of U.S. leadership that has been not just U.S., Canadian, and I would even say an opportunity for Argentinian leadership that's out there that has not been leveraged effectively, is shifting available grains to Ukrainian at-risk states in the world. So I think that's free soft power that should have been leveraged. And I'm sure it's being leveraged a little bit behind the scenes, but not enough. If it was enough, we'd hear about it, because you would see the movement, you'd see the tonnage move, and the impact to farmers would be substantial, and they would want to take advantage of it, take credit for it. So you don't really have that going on right now. And I think that's a big miss, especially as this becomes a long war. I think the US, Canada, and Argentina are really the only three states that are going to have the capacity to do this, because they're the only. Yep, go ahead.
It's interesting. I'm looking at this chart. you know, Egypt used to be a breadbasket of Roman
right.
Empire.
Yep.
Now it's the you know, consumer,
Yeah.
the biggest consumer.
Yeah, and you could objectively say that the main reason for that is
Overpopulation.
It's higher population, but it's also agricultural development policies. They have not, let's say, evolved with the last 40 plus years of science and engineering. If they did, they would still have imports, but it would be mitigated substantially. You know, if the Egyptians, and I think that will start to change. I think this conflict will trigger that. If you look at sort of one of the most, I would say, innovative states in the world with agriculture, given that they have none, is Israel, and they are busily exporting that across their Gulf allies, and I think Egypt is one of those that hasn't yet sort of jumped on that, but I think at some point they and the rest of MENA, the rest of Middle East, North Africa will. So you know, so Morocco, Tunisia, which, let's be honest, another miss here is when we say the EU in agriculture, what we really mean is France is a superpower in agriculture within the EU. Well, France should be stepping up when it comes to North Africa, given their history there. So there is this, we're in this very weird stage of all the participants in the world, basically treating this like a reactive daily conflict, not looking at this longer term. So if this is a longer term conflict, and longer term only has to be getting us past 2 or 3 quarters, because you're going to be so impacting planting seasons, energy cycles into heating oil. I mean, where, you know, if this conflict goes through the spring, this year's done, right? So that means you're looking at a planting season that's broken, and you're looking at an energy cycle going into next winter that starts getting pretty sketchy. So so when you look at ag food dependence across, you know, all these grains, this one I think is important to look at when you look at share of total imports for selected economies or commodities. So Turkey is a massive importer, and they've always been an importer from Russia. That's been part of its, let's say, co-balance during the Cold War. It was actually a very smart Turkish strategy. They always constructed enough co-interdependence. I would argue what the Turks were trying to do with S-300s, S-400 was a ham-fisted version of that didn't work. But it was in that same vein where they tried to play off, and now they're trying to add China to that. They're trying to play off all 3 superpowers in such a sort of chaotic way that nobody knows who's on first. And then you sort of just throw your hands up and you have like, well, why did the Turks buy that from China, this from Russia, and that from us? And everyone just says, I don't know. And that has been a strategic approach, like a strategic ambiguity strategy that Turks have, but they have a huge dependence on Turkey, and they don't on Ukraine. Now, I believe that will change as time goes on, as Ukraine, because Turkey and Ukraine are building a more functional alliance right now. The U.S. is catching up to Turkey's drone phase of the war. So Turkey's provided roughly 50 drones, and these are, I would say, arguably, these are the best drones in history, dollar for dollar, that that Turkey has invented. And we saw this, and I know we did a thing on this session on this last year around the Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict, where you could say that was a proof of concept of the value of those drones, where basically the Azerbaijanis were doing what the Ukrainians are now doing against the Armenians, who were structured like the Russians. It's really kind of an apples to apples.
But the Turkish population mostly supporting Russia right now, is my understanding. I spoke to some of my Turkish friends.
Sure.
That's
because
you know.
Yeah, and I would say the main reason is the Russian investment in Turkey, because as Turkey decided to self-immolate themselves economically in the last couple years with central bank and foreign currency investment policies by devaluing the lira by at one point up to 75+%. Russians became one of the main investors coming in opportunistically, and then during sanctions, Turkey is not sanctioning Russian investment. They're not sanctioning it either, right? It's sort of in its classic Turkish foreign policy approaches. But so Russians are realizing kind of one of the only places they can put their money at scale outside of China and Vietnam is Turkey. And a lot of them have, lifestyles that are friendly to that region. So if you can go back one real quick, just for a second there. So I think what's really important here is to realize that China's dependence on Ukraine was substantial, still is. And so Russia is going to have to step up. And I think one of the things that's happened that's been just talked about recently is that the Russian forces have basically absconded with hundreds of thousands of tons of Ukrainian grain, but obviously they're not really shipping it out, or they're shipping some of it out, but it's a lot more difficult. They're putting it on trains, which is pretty inefficient compared to ships. And my guess is a big chunk of that is either refilling other contracts so the Russians can send grain to China and other impacted states that you would see here, whether it's India, whether it's China, because those are allies. We call them allies. They're not allies of Russia right now. So anyways, I just wanted to cover that because I think that was important. And Indonesia there. I think Indonesia is a unique opportunistic Russian partner going forward, because Indonesia is extremely non-aligned and they're very opportunistic, and they have substantial needs when it comes to energy, grains, commodities, basically everything Russia has. And so I think they could probably get soft bought out, by the Russians going forward. So you have obviously inflation right now. It's not a small temporal thing. It's not a thing that happened last summer for a month or two. We're clearly in an inflationary environment. So over a year, it's a year now, literally, since it really started. And it's becoming global, or it's global first world already, and it's moving its way into the, we don't really say first, second, third world, but into the fully developed world and the developing world. And so this was an example of sort of the production costs, and as fuel and fertilizer, chemicals, seed, machine, and equipment, because of supply chain issues, go up, and obviously labor itself too. You're going to see you've already seen, but a substantial increase in the cost of production of corn. And this is sort of a proxy because the US is extremely efficient. We use, on average, for large scale production, some of the lowest amount of fuel, fertilizer, and chemicals and seed, even though those percentages look high. Those percentages are somewhere between 30 to 70 to 100% less than most other places in the world, just because that's just engineering practices. And so as that goes up substantially in the US, that's going to explode to a point that you have what's called an economics demand destruction, where it's not worth producing it because it ultimately costs too much. You don't get enough market demand.
Well, I mean, in this,
and
go
ahead.
I was going to say, in this situation where US could exercise soft power, as you discussed, could the United States simply not engage in that sort of crop destruction and therefore have all
Yeah.
this grain at its
I
disposal?
mean, absolutely. Like, no BS aside, the U.S. could give its biofuels farmers a big fat tax credit, give us the corn, and then we can broker it to those other states. Those biofarm farmers would get the same economic benefit of it for a cycle, for 1 year cycle, let's say. They'd still replant, they'd still do everything else. And then you could even, if you wanted to really get crazy about it, and no one will do this politically because these people we view them as toxic as the tobacco industry. But my view is, when you have something existential like this, then you need to be willing to work with anyone you need to work with to solve the problem. But the energy companies who have a certain mandated amount of biofuels they need to have based on state requirements, you could give them additional credits or waivers so that they wouldn't use it. And then you could be exporting, a chunk of that corn and some of those other biofuel grains. So we could do that. I mean, and this wouldn't cost a fortune. This would probably be good, smart, bipartisan politics. It would be a win-win for everyone. But, let's be honest, that's not the adult world we're in right now. And I don't see anybody talking about that, but you and me right now. And so, but I mean, so the risk we're in right now that I don't think few people talk about either, is that when you get inflation going for a long enough period of time, you get to demand destruction. It's just an inevitability for obvious reasons, because prices overtake what you're willing to spend on a good. So you look at fertilizer, and it's doubled. I mean, over the last year, basically. And so when you see that prior chart on corn, well, you take that percentage of use of fertilizers and fuels, and we obviously know fuel is doubled. Well, now you're taking that percentage and doubling it, which in the US might be a double. In some other countries, that's a triple because of their logistics. They might not have as efficient they won't have as efficient of logistics as the United States has when it comes to moving fuels and fertilizers and products and packaging around it and distribution. So, when you're tripling the cost, and this is a big deal, because this is for those of you who remember enough about chemistry and biology, I mean, this is the first part of your plant development process, that if you don't have this and the water and the photosynthesis, you don't get much growing.
And what about labor from low-level innovation?
Absolutely. And then the labor is interesting, because one thing you generally get when you get demand destruction in the grain or in the food industries is that labor costs in other areas like cities go up. And so people migrate, and they tend to never come back. So so right now you could be, if this goes on, which at this point I don't see, unless the major powers, to be blunt, they'd have to dump a huge amount of commodities on the market to try to, almost like the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. I would make an argument that's what we should create for these commodities, right? Like almost a commodity reserve, and for humanitarian reasons or for historic events, you can leverage it. But you run the big risk long term of a generation of people in the farming cycle. This goes on for another year or two, given what happened with COVID already. When you're looking at 3, 4, 5 years, you're going to lose a generation of farmers. And when you lose that just drives the cost up permanently. And that becomes your new plateau. So, and the key to fertilizer also is for those of you, I won't demolish your brains on a Sunday and the difference between potashes and, but let's just say there's a bunch of fertilizer coming from a bunch of different places. That's sort of a joke also, but, and those fertilizers have various degrees of readiness to be used. And they either require
one thing,
additional...
Aaron, Greg is going to leave. So
okay.
Thank you, Greg, so much for your
thank you.
contributions.
Absolutely.
And
yes. Thank you, guys.
And you wanted to point out the rice panics.
Now what's interesting about rice, and this is, an advantage that rice has, which if the Asian rice producers could get the support, and the support would be everything. It'd be logistics, it would be, market development, it would be networking, meaning coming together. But if they could get that support, and there could be promotional campaigns in places that are going to be under grain risk of use, then rice could provide a huge amount of that carbohydrate and starch support. But that would require some leadership to do that, because basically rice is very stable on average. There was a period that was linked completely to commodity trading, basically, and bad contract management by rice producers into the crisis in 07, 08, 09. But basically, the price of rice is extremely stable across Asia. And a lot of it has to do with how rice is, let's just say, how unindustrialized rice production is. So it has less input dynamic risk when it comes to inflation. It's basically labor, and it's rural labor. And it has a natural development seasons because of monsoons and rains and, et cetera. So if you go back one slide real quick there, I think it was one slide. Yeah. So this is the last piece about rice, and that the rice inventories have actually exploded. They've really doubled in the last decade plus. So we have a lot of rice in the world. We can create more rice in the world. The question is, can we get people who don't eat a lot of rice because of culture, habit, et cetera, to start eating a little bit? Because they don't have to replace grains. They just have to, sort of eat less grains and replace some of it with rice.
Everybody makes a 5% commitment. It's a
That's
massive
right.
shift.
It makes a huge shift. Absolutely. So the next slide here, this one goes into sort of the gas and logistics. So something to recognize on cost of logistics right now. So you have this, on top of everything else that's going sideways, right? You have, I'll just say, China's strange approach to handling the COVID crisis going into year 3, and this shutting down of huge cities, regions, most of which have some of the largest, if not the largest, ports and logistics distribution in the world. So you have that going on. You already had the natural supply chain issues and logistics issues going on. You had the sort of Trump triggered and just sort of market induced shift, rebalancing away from China logistically, kind of the new value chain that put huge pressures on shipping and logistics. That's number 3. You have obviously the Ukraine crisis and all of the shift in fuels. So that's number 4. So you just have a feedback loop right now that is very, very contagious and devastating. And then on top of it, and this is something when I discovered this was great to understand, is that when you look at landlocked countries, landlocked developing countries versus lower developed countries versus small developing states versus the rest of the world, the container freight rate price increases have exploded, and are exploding. And a lot of it just comes down to it's not worth the effort by logistics providers to go to these smaller developed states. And I believe it opens an opportunity for some stronger regional states like Australia, who could be providing, could become kind of a logistics superpower to the Micronesia and the microstates and a lot of the Southeastern Asian states who just aren't going to get much support right now. And then I think in the lesser developed world, the true global South, the deep global South, I would call it, you need a set of states that can be supported, whether it's Australia, Chile, Argentina, South Africa, that could provide a lot of shipping regional security. And if you don't get that, you're going to have an explosion in cost of consumer goods because they're just not going to get there. And when they get there, they're going to cost a fortune to take them there. And you're just going to have a bunch of goods off the market. So that's likely to increase black market and so on. And now where Europe gets its gas, look, obviously that top chunk from Estonia all the way down into, Croatia, basically, you have a predominance of Russian gas that's going there. And then now, obviously, places like France, which have very strong nuclear. I mean, arguably, France is probably the most balanced energy state in the world, probably actually not even a close second. And France has obviously huge support of energy contracts through North Africa. So France, if they could network, so that's the problem you have in Europe. You have a very poorly networked energy system. When I say network, I mean like pipelines. And a lot of it has to do with, to be blunt, the shift to green energy has triggered a de-investment in legacy energy infrastructure. I would say to a unbalanced level, because you wouldn't get to green, pure alternative, as fast as you would have needed to re-maintain your legacy industry, right? You would have to re-maintain the legacy network to some degree. And that's going to be very difficult for the Europeans to do, to be honest, because those industries have sort of disappeared, except to Eastern Europe or to the US, Canada, the Americas, Brazil, Argentina, Caribbean, et cetera, Venezuela, whatever, Mexico. So, they're going to have to reinvest in legacy networking of their energy systems so they can get all this available energy from the UK, from Norway, from France, North Africa, through Turkey, through Central Asia, and get that into the rest of Europe. And there's, I would argue, there's a collision. There's a political, there's deadlocked, and between the Greens and the not Greens, let's say, and making those investments. The Greens are saying, forget legacy, all in on alternative, deal with it and suffer until we get there. And I don't think that's a politically realistic position to take, given the scale of this risk that they have. And then Europeans made a choice not to take US LNG, which was a historic mistake. And so now they're racing to build the LNG terminals in Europe that they didn't want to build for a decade plus, since the 06, 7, 8, 9, the fracking revolution, basically, in the US and Canada. And so that will take probably 2 to 3 years, realistically, for the LNG terminals to be built to make enough of a difference. So I think there is a huge energy security problem in Europe, and I think nobody is being as realistic as and to be honest, if the Russians get enough contracts in the next 6 months, that could be their sort of soft power, whatever you might want to call it, economic neutron bomb, is to cut off energy supplies. So global oil. So Russia, is part of OPEC plus. So basically, half the energy in the world is OPEC plus, half isn't. So the US has a pretty substantial amount of energy that we could produce. We obviously, this is a real issue, right? We have this dynamic in the world where if all things were fine, we would say, let's slowly go off of let's, as fast as we could, go off of our legacy energy. Let's not invest in it. Let's, pour all our resources in alternative, et cetera. But that's not the world we're in right now. We are in a world of half a dozen catastrophic economic, energy, commodity logistics collisions. And we still basically, from the social democrat and democratic side of politics right now in the whole world, sort of saying, well, let's see what happens, or let's see if we get through it. And I just don't think, being realistic, that is feasible right now. I think we have to make a substantial shift. You go back one slide real quick here. So the price of steel has exploded, 2, 3x, 4x. Why is that important? Well, you got to make wind turbines, right? If you want alternative energy. And turbine, in the real turbines, I don't mean like when you have outside your house. If you lived in a rural area and you got out around a farm, that's fine. But we're talking industrial utility scale turbines. They use an enormous amount of steel. I mean, we're talking the amount of steel that, each one is using the amount of steel that, maybe hundreds of thousands of cars would use. So the amount of steel and the quality of steel they have to use. So they're having to use the higher A grade
and
steel.
you don't just have one, but you basically have to have Brooklyn Bridge worths of steel.
That's right.
To construct the wind farms that you would
That's
need.
right. That's exactly right. So you're talking about a world where you're trying to put up, let's say realistically, thousands of those turbines a year. So when steel goes up 4x, and by the way, how do you heat that steel? Well, you need energy. Right. And no offense, there's no electrical energy-based heating sources yet. Plums that you can heat that kind of steel at that level of steel plant molds. So you're using natural gas, fired power plants on site typically. And so you have this vicious cycle going on right now. When it comes to all of these commodities that we say we need, and we do need to live or to live in a better future. And we are in this collision with, we need to invest in the past in the short term, 5 years, maybe 10 years, so that we can get through this to get to the future. And nobody seems to have the ability to put that phrase together and not get gaslit on Twitter or, in politics or anywhere else. If you go to the next slide real quick here. So you obviously see this boom we were talking about, and these are the different types of steel. The reason this is important is obviously the world's developing countries are constructing cities like they never have in history. And so how do you build those cities? Well, you use a lot of rebar. And what do you do for soft infrastructure? You use a lot of rebar. And then hot rolled coil you're using for all these more sophisticated things. And don't underestimate the amount of steel EVs need or hybrids need, because they're so heavy. They need to be heavy. You're building basically tank compartments to keep those battery packs safe, and to keep the drivers safe, and to keep it safe from an accident, et cetera. So so you have this steel boom right now, which is running up against the available commodities. And if you go to the next slide real quick. So here's the wind turbines. They were expensive 7, 8, 9 years ago because they were just being developed, the first generation of them from Siemens and GE and Mitsubishi and so on. But then you had this, this wonderful kind of phase where they were scaling, and now you're in this other world where,
since we're at the witching hour, I just want to ask if there are any final questions, comments, concerns about Ukraine, about the economic situation around the world that's directly affected by this, and also to thank you for taking your time and putting together all these slides. I'm sure those who are watching are very interested in this.
Yeah, we can cover some next time too. For those of you that are interested. And so, any other questions or
Somebody says, well,
comments?
you should do something about it. And Aaron
We're
and
doing
I,
our presentation. That's what
yeah, no,
we
it's
can
like
do about it.
this is our joke that we often have of, there's that moment in the movie where everybody's like, just do something, and then suddenly
Exactly.
Superman shows out of left field. And so the fundamental issue is that doing something requires a lot of institutional actors to move, and so we don't have that kind of power, and the institutional actors have a lot of vested interests against doing what we're proposing.
Yeah. Now, I will say this: the media doesn't, and since given most of this stuff comes from the financial media, and they do a good job because I didn't put these slides together myself, obviously. There is this gap, and I really think it's a very real gap between this sort of gossipy TMZ news that people consume and this type of stuff. And I think if there is something we can do, is people can share this type of information. This is available, basically for free or for a very low cost, and share this stuff with other people, so that people can start to have, let's say, a more intelligent and intelligible conversation about these things. Because if you can't, then the only place we are is, what color socks people are wearing and all these weird stuff that, people do every day that seems to be modern reality TV news.
Yeah. All right. So I think, yeah.
Oh, and one other quick point. I don't want to underestimate that this isn't just an American anti-intellectualism. Maybe we exported it, but it's a joke. But this is a pretty global phenomenon as people are being satiated with, the modern narcissistic lifestyle. And I just think that's a dynamic. So it's not just limited to Americans are dumb. I think there's a global dumbness, or people throwing their hands in the air saying there's nothing they can do about it.
So one last question before we close down is, what is our next time that we're meeting up on Ukraine? We haven't decided that. That would probably be in late May or more likely early June.
Exactly.
And we'll keep in touch with all four groups, right? Because there's history mostly ancient, which is our group. And then there are the Robert's three groups, New York, DC, and London activities. So hopefully.
Exactly. And one quick point here. Hopefully you guys like the fact that by us stretching this out a little bit, month, 5 weeks, whatever, we can sort of take a wider berth, a wider sort of view of what's going on. It's not trapped in the day-to-day ups and downs. We can take this as a broader survey. And if there's topics that you want us to cover, please let us know, because we're open to it. I plan on covering more on the economic side of it. And then obviously as the conflict evolves or devolves, we'll cover that. But we also plan on covering the shift in the security environment. So there's another presentation that we do too, which is on the sort of history and the now of the EU. And I'm sure some of you have attended that. So the next one will be discussing basically the shift in the European security today, because May is a big month. You have the European, basically the European Defense Summit. You have the NATO Defense Summit, and you also have the strategic compass that's going to be basically, it's not really voted on, but it's going to be agreed to within the European Commission. And so you're going to have a bunch of stuff coming out of that we plan on covering both in the EU one, but also to some degree here, especially vis-a-vis Ukraine, because my belief is that the Europeans are going to be stepping up in a larger way going forward when it comes to Ukrainian defense and security.
Yep. Yeah, I think we're gonna, I'm debating whether to do that presentation on the 29th, which is in the middle of Memorial Day weekend.
You mean
will
people
come-
don't want to do Memorial Day break while they're recovering from their hangover and learn about Ukrainian security and defense?
So anyway.
All right, thank you guys.
Yeah.
Thank
so
you,
I guess we'll
everybody.
close out.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you.
Thanks so much, guys,
Appreciate it.
and enjoy your Sunday.
Yeah.
All
Thank you
right.
guys. Bye.
All right. Bye.